Tanjiro fought to keep his breathing even. His left leg was bent awkwardly, from when he'd had to block a strike in the air and been flung into a building. There was also a fire in his chest that told him one or more of his ribs was likely to be broken. Across from him, half of Jitaro's neck was reforming along with several deep gashes on his chest. "You are good as dead now," Jitaro cackled, pointing out Kaijiro's side. A line of blood trickled away from a deep gash in Kaijiro's side. The gash was painful, but didn't seem to have hit an artery or anything vital. Ordinarily, Kaijiro wouldn't have paid much attention to it, but with poison on the blades, it was a critical hit. "If you think," Kaijiro said, "I am going to lay down and die thanks to a little cut. You are a fool." Jitaro's sharp smile remained unchanged. "Act all tough if you want. The poison will take all that strength away in the end." "The poison will take away nothing," Kaijiro replied. "It changes nothing. I still have a duty and I will fulfill it. I cannot do otherwise." "Big words," Jitaro sneered. "But you'll weaken soon and then you'll be screaming. I think I'll start with those legs of yours first. They'll be useless to you anyway." Springing forward, Kaijiro launched several of his fastest strikes. He had faith enough in his physical strength to stall the poison, at least for the time being. But he couldn't afford to waste time. Dying and leaving Tanjiro and the others to die from this monster was unacceptable. Jitaro blocked most of the slashes, but hissed as one painted a bloody, jagged line across one of his sides. He raised his sickles to chop downwards at Kaijiro and then froze. In an instant, he had turned himself around and was hurtling down the street away from Kaijiro. They must have beheaded Daki, Kaijiro realized. He is running to help her get her head back. Hope surged through him and he flew forwards faster than before. He managed to outpace Jitaro and block his path. The demon tried to use its momentum to leap over him, but Kaijiro leaped up and swung at him, forcing him back. "Out of my way," Jitaro roared. Blood sickles sliced through the air toward Kaijiro, but he blocked or dodged every one of them. No matter what, he couldn't let Jitaro through. Jitaro tried to get around Kaijiro again, taking a hideously painful slash that lopped off one arm before being pushed back again. "You are really annoying," Jitaro said. "You're already history and yet you are still keeping me from getting to my little sister." His arm was slowly regrowing itself from the stump. Kaijiro capitalized, forcing the demon to take several more bad hits and go back several more feet to avoid decapitation. The demon's arm came back and it created a wall of blood sickles to force Kaijiro out of its way. Unfortunately for it, Kaijiro knew it couldn't go through the blood sickles and had to wait for them to clear. Several more exchanges occurred, blades and blood flying faster than most human eyes could see. Then Kaijiro took a hard kick to the stomach which sent shocks of pain through his ribs and nearly made him vomit. His limbs were shaking slightly and his next attacks were slower. "It's already beginning to work," Jitaro giggled. "You can't possibly keep up with me. It's only a matter of time." As if to illustrate its point, it sent a blood sickle winging over the rooftops. Kaijiro's eyes widened when he realized the direction it was going in. It had to be on a crash course with whoever had Daki's head. Zenitsu seemed to hear it first. He was running alongside Yoriichi behind Inosuke to block Daki's OBs at first, then to protect against Jitaro as they got further from the main body. Zenitsu suddenly tensed and shouted, "Get down!" Yoriichi hit the tiles of the roof they were on and Zenitsu did the same as well as Inosuke. With a loud tearing sound, the blood sickle zoomed through the air above them and rushed back to its owner. How did Jitaro see to aim that strike? Yoriichi wondered. He looked around for the second upper six and couldn't see it. Is it some extra sensory power? Told you that you'd never get away with it, Daki yelled exultantly. You are all going to die. Die. Die for what you did to me. Yoriichi looked down at her and then spotted the third eye on her forehead, the one he'd thought might be connected to Jotaro. Understanding dawned. Inosuke, Yoriichi called as he shrugged out of his Haori. Take this. He flung the green and black checkered cloth at the boar slayer who caught it in his free hand. Hey, I am not your servant, Inosuke said. Carry your own Haori if you are hot. Wrap the head in it, Yoriichi said. Unless you want another attack like the one that just happened. Jotaro will still sense the direction we went in, but without being able to see through that eye on her head, he won't be able to aim properly. Inosuke straightened up and then wrapped the head in the Haori. Hey, it protested. This stinks. Don't you dare wrap me up in some filthy old cloth. Its voice was muffled slightly. Maybe that was a bit of a side benefit. Keep running, Yoriichi said. We have to get moving now. Inosuke grumbled about being told what to do, but set off again with other two tailing him. They were a long ways away from the initial battleground and Yoriichi was starting to feel cautious optimism when he felt Kaijuro's presence suddenly weaken. Still alive yet guttering slightly, like a flame on the edge of extinction. No, Yoriichi thought. Before he could turn back, he felt the overwhelming presence of the second half of Upper Six grow suddenly closer. The house beneath them exploded into splinters. Zenitsu, on one of the few patches of the roof still whole, reached out for Yoriichi's hand. He wasn't close enough. As he plummeted through the air, Yoriichi tried to orient himself so he would land on his side. If not for Nezuko's box, he could have tried to roll and dissipate the momentum. Rolling with the box, though, would risk squishing Nezuko. The impact as he hit the ground made his vision go white. He lay there stunned for several seconds and then slowly managed to get to his knees. The entire city around him was on fire. Yoriichi could sense Zenitsu from underneath a pile of rubble and Inosuke under a larger one not much farther away. For a moment, both Upper SXS presences seemed far away and then suddenly they were close again. Daki stood on the rubble piles Zenitsu and Inosuke were beneath, glaring down at him while Jotaro approached him lazily. Kaijuro, Yoriichi thought. If Jotaro is here and he isn't, then the poison must be what's killing him. If we don't finish this soon, he'll die. The entire line of thought was ridiculous, of course. The way things were going, Yoriichi was going to die along with Kaijuro, Zenitsu, Inosuke, and Nezuko. But it still bothered him. Like somehow he'd be letting Kasajiri down if Kaijuro died. Slowly, Yoriichi got to his feet and slid his blade into a guard. Upper Six simply smiled and kept its approach casual. After all that, you are still going, Jotaro commented. I'd almost say you were strong. Jotaro held up a clawed finger. Almost. You weren't even strong enough to protect your friends. They must all be dead now and that Hashira will soon follow. Do you think he'll cry when I tell him all his precious comrades are dead? That his bold predictions of no one dying were a complete lie. Careful brother, Daki said. Its eyes were locked on the box on Yoriichi's shoulders. His sister is still alive and she's in that box. She's the one who set my face on fire. I still don't know how she did it. Be careful. Your sister. Jotaro asked Yoriichi, suddenly stopping. Well, that is a surprise. You fight with a sister too, do you? You are too weak to defend her now, though. Jotaro seemed almost contemplative as it eyed him. I have soft spot for guys like you. Older brothers trying to save their siblings. Maybe I don't have to kill you. It paused and Yoriichi knew it was winding up to something. He was unsurprised when it continued. If you agree to become a demon, that is. I can't guarantee it will work, but it beats dying, right? You'd be just like your sister. I might even be able to get Lord Muzan to spare her. Yoriichi didn't move. The worst thing, absolute worst thing that could happen to him in this second life was to become a demon. Kibutsuji would gain complete control over his mind and actions if he did. Likely, the demon lord would be able to figure out Yoriichi's identity. Not only would Yoriichi have failed, he would spend the rest of his life in agony, a helpless pawn of the worst evil to walk the earth. What do you say? Jotaro asked, reaching out a hand. Try it, Yoriichi said. And I'll kill both of us before I allow it to happen. Jotaro shook its head. Here I thought you couldn't stoop so low. You are failures. Each and every single one of you. Including that Hashira. And you. You are the worst by far. Not strong enough to save your friends or your sister, and you refuse to do the only thing that would help her. You are more pathetic than even me. Failure. It wasn't anything Yoriichi hadn't heard before. From the Hashiras in the trial in his first life. From himself. None of it was new. You are too late, Yoriichi said. Huh. I've been told I'm a failure. Time and time again, Yoriichi said. But it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter? Jotaro cried. How could it not matter? Once you're a failure, your life is done. There is nothing in this world you can do to get rid of the shame. Yes, Yoriichi said. I am shamed. Weak and maybe even tainted. None of that matters. What matters is how I chose to push forward. Yoriichi took a step towards the demon. And I choose to fight. One of Jotaro's hands came up and clawed at its face. You are really starting to annoy me, Jotaro growled. I hate guys like you. Guys who can't understand how pitiful they are. I hate guys who are strong and popular, but I hate guys like you most of all. I am going to make sure this hurts. The demon raised both of its scythes. Yoriichi's legs were shaking and the tip of the sword wavered slightly. He wasn't going to last long against Jotaro's attacks. This was it. 2 chances at killing Muzan Kibutsuji, and he just hadn't been strong enough. Jotaro swung his scythes in an arc and Yoriichi managed to deflect them with his blade. Another strike, another deflection. I can't get into a lock with it, Yoriichi thought. If it so much as nicks me, the poison will kill me. As long as I make it miss, I can survive. Apparently, Jotaro came to the same conclusion. It raised its scythes and cleaved the air in 2 violent strokes. Blood sickles hung through the air towards Yoriichi. He didn't have any way to block them and he couldn't move himself and Nezuko away fast enough. All he could do was hope they hit a non-vital area, and the poison took a while to work. Before the sickles reached Yoriichi, however, someone landed in front of him and swung a burning blade at them. As Yoriichi looked, he realized the figure itself also seemed to be burning, the heat so intense that Yoriichi could feel it from feet away. It took only a moment for him to recognize the white Haori with its distinctive flame edging. Kaijuro Rengoku leveled his gaze at Jotaro and raised his sword. Don't turn your back on an opponent until you know they are finished, Kaijuro said. Jotaro took a step back, eyes wide. From her position on the roof of a building nearby, Kaijuro saw Daki's mouth hanging open slightly. He didn't blame for being surprised. When Jotaro had left him, Kaijuro had been on his knees and unable to move. Stay right there, Jotaro said. I'll come back for you when my sister is healed and the others are dealt with. There's plenty of moonlight left. Plenty of time to enjoy my meal. You're going to be in a lot of pain, so look forward to it. Kaijuro had been helpless to do anything, but watch as Jotaro leaped across the rooftops to kill Tanjiro and the others. His thoughts didn't linger on his impending death or upper 6 promises. Being Hashira meant accepting death. There was a reason very few Hashira lasted long enough to grow old. Getting eaten wasn't unexpected either. He'd long ago accepted that might happen. The thought of Senjuro being left all alone with only their father tore at his heart. He imagined what his father would do. Drink himself into a stupor, probably, and say it was Kaijuro's own fault for trying without any talent. Father would try to pretend he'd seen it coming and it didn't bother him. But it would bother him. It would break his already broken heart even further. Would he drink himself to death when all was said and done? Would Tanjiro be completely alone? Tanjiro had thought about all of that, but they were old thoughts. The worries that kept him awake at night sometimes. What bore down on Tanjiro were the new thoughts. The thought of his brave Tsugako and the sister he'd been so devoted to. Of the boar slayer and the yellow-haired boy. They were so young and tried their hardest to protect people with the strength they had been born with. They didn't deserve to be 4 more names added to the list of upper 6 victims. The more he thought about it, the more fury burned through him. After a few minutes, it began to literally burn through him. To Tanjiro's surprise, his body became enveloped in a haze heat. It burned so hot and fast that his blood sang with it. He found himself able to stand up and to move faster than he ever had before. He jumped onto the rooftops and rushed towards the spot where he felt his Tsugako and the 3 others. Now he stood in front of Jotaro, feeling stronger than he ever had before. "What's going on?" Jotaro snarled. "You should be paralyzed or so weak you couldn't stumble here at all." Tanjiro didn't respond. He flew at Jotaro, unleashing moves in a blur of heat and motion. Upper 6 eyes widened and he growled as Tanjiro blade dug into his side, then his shoulder and his arm. "You should be weak," Jotaro shouted. "How? How are you so much stronger than you were before?" Tanjiro didn't know himself and he'd wasted enough time talking before. He started to attack again, then saw Daki coming towards him and Jotaro. Before Tanjiro could turn to face her, Tanjiro spoke, "I've got Daki. You take care of Jotaro. Both heads have to be off for them to die." Keeping his eye on Jotaro, Tanjiro risked a quick turn of his head to look at Tanjiro. "I'll leave her to you then," Tanjiro said. He darted forward to resume his own battle. It took all Yoriichi's willpower to wrench his attention back to the approaching Daki. He'd seen it when Tanjiro turned, a mark curling up from his neck to his chin, an identical one on his temple on the opposite side of his face. Tanjiro Rengoku had somehow managed to manifest a mark as he was dying. Now he was doomed. "I can't think about that now," Yoriichi thought. He moved between Daki and the fight between Tanjiro and Jotaro. "Move, you stupid little boy," Daki shouted. "If you start running now, you might make it far enough away to last night. You and that ugly troll you call a sister. So leave. Leave now." Yoriichi took a deep breath. He thought of his siblings from this life, their wide vacant eyes. Of his mother, lying on top of Rokuta in a pool of blood. Yuta curled up in a fetal ball, uselessly trying to protect her stomach and their child. Nezuko, his kind sweet sister who refused to use any of their money to buy a kimono and continued to patch up the same one, year after year. Michikatsu sharing a cup of tea with him over a low fire after the end of a hard night's work. Rage. Colder and more violent than he ever let himself feel, blossomed and grew into a bonfire. When he attacked Daki, his strikes were fast and precise. Every obi was cut through like paper, each strike blocked. He used a fusion of water and sun breathing. Enough water to keep the strain from killing his body, enough sun to make sure each strike had power behind it. Daki screamed and her eyes turned wide with fear, even the one in the center of her forehead. She was backing away slowly. Yoriichi cleaved through her neck, but it turned into an obi at the last minute and he couldn't quite break it. More of her obis were coming up, preparing to skewer him from several different angles. If he backed off, her head would go back onto her body. Staying meant he would die. Before he could back up, there was a bright flash and one half of the obis fluttered in pieces around the leaping form of Zenitsu. The boy's eyes were still screwed tightly shut, yet his strikes were still fast and precise. The rest of the obis were torn and twisted by a pair of serrated blades. Inosuke's laughter sounded wild and unhinged as he continued attacking the obis. "Tanjiro," Zenitsu shouted. "Do it." Turning back to Daki, whose eyes were wide as she stared at the unexpected reinforcements. Yoriichi pulled his blade back and let his breathing quicken, allowing pure sun breathing to flow through him. Daki's eyes snapped back to him. "No," she shouted. "You can't. I am upper 6. I won't be defeated by." Her words devolved into a scream. Yoriichi's blade had struck her in a wheel of crimson steel and sliced through her neck. Yoriichi picked up her head and tossed it to Zenitsu. "Inosuke, defend him. I'm going to help Rengoku." Yoriichi turned back to the fight and saw Kyojuro crouching, his entire body tense, blade held ready. There was a massive surge of power building in his presence. Even Jotaro seemed to have felt it because the air was thick with the demon's blood attacks. With a roar, Kyojuro shot through the attacks, some of them cut into him slightly, but the rest were burned away by the sheer power radiating from him. He reached Jotaro and swung the blade upward in a high arc, cleaving through the demon's neck in one powerful blow. The head flew off and over Yoriichi's head. It had worked. Yoriichi could feel both demon presences fading, but Jotaro still seemed to be building up power. Kyojuro seemed to recognize it as well. "Run," he yelled. "Run now." All 4 demon slayer turned and ran with every bit of strength they could summon. They made it several feet away from the battleground and were still too late. A massive wave of blood sickles erupted from Jotaro's body, a last, desperate wave of power meant to kill whoever managed to end it. The buildings around the slayers were torn to rubble. Before they could reach the demon slayers, though, Nezuko jumped out of her box and into the air. Reaching out her hands, she bathed the air in magenta fire, burning away the blood sickles. The demon slayers were sent flying from the force of the attacks, but not sliced by them. After a few moments, Yoriichi opened his eyes. They had all been blown in different directions, so he couldn't see any of the others. Zenitsu and Inosuke's presences were exhausted and ragged, but steady. Kyojuro's had dimmed back down, but stayed steady as well. The mark must have saved his life by burning through the poison even if it had doomed him in an entirely different way. When Yoriichi's eyes opened, he was sitting on a porch with a warm weight in his arms. The sun shone from a bright, clear morning sky. A faint breeze stirred his hair and brought with it the scent of cherry blossoms. Looking down, Yoriichi realized the weight in his arms was a baby wrapped in a light purple blanket. The baby's eyes were closed and deep breaths came from the little open mouth. The cheeks were flushed a healthy shade of pink. "He's sound asleep," a familiar voice said from over Yoriichi's shoulder. "My wife's fast asleep in the other room. Thanks so much for watching him." Yoriichi turned slightly to see a man reddish-brown hair in a green-checked haori, much like the one Yoriichi wore in his second life. His face was open, kind, and currently split by a warm smile. He carried a tray with a clay teapot and a cup for tea, a small bowl of soup, and some onigiri on it. "I feel bad for making our guest babysit," the man, Sumiyoshi, said. He put the tray down between himself and Yoriichi, then gently took the baby from Yoriichi. "You don't need to feel bad. Your wife must be exhausted. Giving birth to a child is not an easy task," Yoriichi found himself saying. He thought of Yuta. If everything had gone right, it would have been his child he was holding not a second ago. His wife, his Yuta sleeping in their house. Yoriichi took the cup of tea and swallowed back his sadness. Sumiyoshi didn't need to be burdened with his troubles. Not with a new family to think about. "I will be leaving after this," Yoriichi said. Staying in one place for too long was a temptation he couldn't afford. Yoriichi was no longer a demon slayer, but there were still people out there who needed his help. There was also Michikatsu to think about. Besides, Sumiyoshi shouldn't have to worry about guests at a time like this. He didn't need another burden. "I don't want to overstay my welcome is all." Sumiyoshi's smile disappeared and he looked at Yoriichi with a worried expression. "Please sir, this child was born because you saved us that day. I would have died and so would my wife." Yoriichi continued to drink his tea. Eventually, Sumiyoshi's shoulders slumped. At least let me pass your name down so it will be remembered, Sumiyoshi said. No need for that. You and your wife and child can live a peaceful, happy life. That's all I need, Yoriichi said. He meant it too. Saving people helped give him a small spark of brightness in his life. A moment of light against his otherwise black record of failure. But didn't you say you were at a loss because you don't have any heirs? Look, I know I am only a charcoal merchant, but surely that is better than nothing, Sumiyoshi said. Finishing his tea, Yoriichi set it on the tray and started on the rest of the food. Thank you, Sumiyoshi, but there is no need for you to do that. His expression was solemn as he turned to face Sumiyoshi. Everyone who masters their skills shares the same fate. They wind up in the same place. No matter what era they are in, and will find their way back if lost. He stood up. His familiar sword, the one with the beaten gold hilt, lay on the deck. He picked it up and slid it into his belt without having to look at it. Sumiyoshi, you seem to think of me as an extraordinary person, but I am not. I failed to protect everyone and everything important to me. Throughout my life, I never accomplished my goals. My name is as worthless as I myself am. Yoriichi started to walk away. You never change. Do you? Not even with a second chance at life? The words froze Yoriichi in his tracks. He turned to see Sumiyoshi smiling. I don't know what you mean, Yoriichi said. I never got a chance to say it the first time, Sumiyoshi said. You left before I could say anything to you. But we still have some time left. Your body is currently in a coma. You're strong, so you'll wake up soon. In the meantime, we may as well talk. Slowly Yoriichi returned to the porch and sat down next to Sumiyoshi. Back to what I wanted to say. Yoriichi, don't talk about yourself that way. I am not the only one you've saved over the years. You have tremendous strength and you've always used it to help others. That's not something a lot of people can say, Sumiyoshi said. I failed, Yoriichi said. Not just in my first life either. When I had a second chance, I buried my head in the sand. I let other people suffer and die because I didn't want to save them. I ran and it cost my family their life again. It cost my sibling humanity again. You always see the best in people, Sumiyoshi. But you are wrong about me. I don't deserve anything. A soft hand landed on Yoriichi's shoulder. Sumiyoshi gave a comforting squeeze before letting go. You shouldn't talk about yourself that way, Sumiyoshi said, voice quiet, but firm. You are not a failure. Having extra strength and other abilities doesn't make you any more than human. It doesn't make you a god. You can't control everything that happens. All you can do is your best, and you have done that already. So you decided not to awaken for a while. You did it because you wanted to be happy. There is nothing wrong with that. Do you not remember what you said to Jotaro? It is not about how you have failed in the past, it is about how you move forward. You are doing that quite well. You are protecting your sister, training with a Hashira, and continuing to save people. She never should have been turned, Yoriichi said. My family died and it was all my fault. Sumiyoshi shook his head. You weren't with them when you were attacked. You are not omniscient. Remember what I said about you not being a god. But, Yoriichi began. Sumiyoshi reached over and flicked him in the forehead. The sharp pain from the flick barely even registered, but Yoriichi stared at Sumiyoshi. For the normally polite Sumiyoshi to do something like that. That's a bad habit you have, always trying to make everything your fault. Just accept it. You are not the master of the universe. You are just stumbling your way through it like the rest of us. A tugging sensation started in Yoriichi's gut. Looks like you are waking up, Sumiyoshi said. We are almost out of time. So please just listen. I think you were given a second chance for a reason. What happened last time was not your fault. You deserve a second try to kill Muzan and to be happy.
I know that you can get everything you seek back. Your sister, your brother, all of it. Keep trying your hardest and never, never think of yourself as worthless. Because I don't and neither does anyone else around you. Yoriichi felt another wrenching tug. Sumiyoshi smiled sadly and gave a little wave. The next second, the world went black and then he was opening sticky eyelids. Kaneo's face hovered over him, eyes wide with shock. Are you okay? You've been out for a month. Ever since your fight with Upper Six, Kaneo said. A month? That explained why Yoriichi felt so weak that even looking up at Kaneo took effort. He tried to move his arms and legs, gauge how much strength they had lost. They barely twitched. Seemed he still had a ways to go before he recovered. Thanks goodness you woke up. We were so worried, Kaneo said, tears forming at the corner of her eyes. That was when Yoriichi noticed it. Her presence, still vast a hollow had a flicker inside of it. Like a small candle. It wasn't much, but it gave her presence a soft sort of light. She was also talking to him. Maybe, the cold shell around her was starting to melt and one day, she would be full of hope and life. The thought warmed him down to his inert toes. A dim presence, not strong enough to be a swordsman, but steady approached the room. A Kikushi appeared with a small tray of food in hand. He knelt and picked up what sounded like glass. Moments later, he reappeared with the tray of food. This is for him. Feel free to eat it if it starts to go bad, though, the Kikushi said. The food smelled warm, buttery and amazing. Yoriichi knew without thinking he probably couldn't eat it just yet. He likely wouldn't be allowed anything solid for at least a few days. Still, he thanked the Kikushi. The Kikushi jumped back, dropping the Castilla, and his eyes practically bulged out of their sockets. He began yelling at Kaneo for not informing anyone Tanjiro was awake, then ran to the door frame and yelled for Aoi and the three little girls. Moments later the Kyo, Sumi, and Naho surrounded Yoriichi's bed, crying. Sumi was offering him a cracker while one of the other little girls asked why there was Castilla on the bed. Please don't cry, Yoriichi told them. I'm okay. A thud sounded from the hall. A white sheet flew into the room with a pair of short legs clad in black trousers underneath it. The little girls screamed about ghosts then relaxed when Aoi pulled herself out from under the sheet. Don't ever scare me like that again, Aoi cried into Yoriichi's sheets. I thought you were going tot hat you would I can't lose another friend. Despite her tears, Yoriichi couldn't help, but feel a little thrill of happiness at the word, friend. What about the others? How are they doing? Yoriichi asked. Zenitsu had been the first to recover it seemed. He'd been sent out on missions, against his will, of course as Sumi said with a smile. Yoriichi didn't like to think of Zenitsu out there on his own. He had to trust, though, that his friend was strong enough to survive without help. If nothing else, the battle with Upper Six had certainly shown Zenitsu's hidden strengths. Even as he asked about Inosuke, Yoriichi could feel his presence in the room. By the time Aoi was tearfully describing Inosuke's condition, he had already located Inosuke on the ceiling. He nodded along to Aoi's frightening words and then asked. So he is not on the ceiling then? Everyone looked up, following the direction of Yoriichi's gaze. Inosuke was indeed pressed against the ceiling like a spider on a wall. He leaped down, cackling at Yoriichi's perceptiveness. I was already looking up, Yoriichi said mildly. The girls got his attention and showed him a book with a strange creature called Honey Badger. It was immune to poison and could pierce just about anything. He couldn't argue that it didn't fit Inosuke well. Aoi started yelling at Inosuke to rest, so she seemed to overcome her tears. What about Kaijuro? Yoriichi asked, raising his voice above the din. He felt his eyelids starting to close. If he didn't get an answer soon, he would fall asleep before he could get it. The flame Hashira? Naho asked. He's also not doing so good. Yoriichi's chest constricted. Is he?
He isn't dead, the Kikuchi said quickly. But the injuries the flame Hashira sustained fighting upper 6 were grave. The insect Hashira says he somehow exhausted his body to the point of near death. He was in a coma like you when he arrived, but woke up about 3 days ago. That's good, Yoriichi said. There was something in the back of his mind. Something he needed to tell Kaijuro. He tried to reach for it, but it was like trying to catch Kaneo without total concentration breathing. Eventually, he gave up and drifted off. 3 days. That's how long it took for his body to heal itself enough for him to start walking around again. He planned to seek out Kaijuro the next day, but woke up the next morning to find the man sitting by his bedside. Good to see you are doing well, young Kamado, Kaijuro said. Several bandages peeked from beneath his sleeves and around his neck. A crutch leaned against the wall beside him and there was a small scar on his forehead. There were no other marks on his face. Yoriichi studied it surreptitiously and found nothing, even in the transparent world. I am glad to see you are safe too, Rengoku, Yoriichi said. What we accomplished has had a certain impact, Kaijuro said. For the first time in over a century, an upper moon has been killed. I have already spoken with Master and the other Hashira. He says this promises great things to come. It seemed Kaijuro hadn't taken all the credit for killing upper 6 then, even though he had fought the true upper 6 the most. Humble and kind. Just like his great ancestor. With a pang, Yoriichi remembered what he wanted to talk to Kaijuro about. He didn't really need to do it, though, did he? The mark on Kaijuro's forehead had disappeared, so maybe it didn't predict the same death sentence it had for all the others. He'd have to watch Kaijuro more before he knew for sure. There'd been a lot of confusion that night and Kaijuro hadn't killed the demon alone. He should be safe. A niggling voice in the back of Yoriichi's head whispered that he was making excuses to avoid telling Kaijuro the truth. To keep his identity as Tanjiro and avoid being known as Yoriichi for as long as possible. He banished it. Kaijuro didn't need to be distracted by a death sentence he may or may not have. He didn't need to know. Kaijuro chatted with Yoriichi a bit more and then stood up. I need to go back to my room. There is little training to be done with both of us still recovering. Once we are fully on the mend, though, I will expect your full effort in training. What you and the others did that night in the entertainment district was amazing, a feat worthy of being a Hashira. But you have some ways to go yet, I think. Let's get you going again as soon as possible. Again, Yoriichi felt that twinge. The thought that he should say something. He pushed it down. He'd think it all over again later, when he had time. If he concluded it was necessary to Kaijuro's safety, he would say something, he promised. But there never seemed to be time to do it. If he wasn't sleeping the sleep of the dead exhausted, he was doing rehabilitation training or training with Kaijuro. What we need to work on the most is your stamina, Kaijuro said as Yoriichi swung a practice sword again and again. Flame breathing uses momentum to create powerful swings and slashes. That odd style of breathing, sun breathing, I believe you called it, seems to use a similar principle in part. For you to be able to use both flame and sun breathing, then you will need greater stamina. So keep pushing it. As fast as you can for as long as you can. Kaijuro's definition of what Yoriichi could do barely fit. After running endless laps, swinging his sword until he felt like his arms would swing off with the next strike, Yoriichi would collapse onto his bed and pass out. If not for his stronger than normal body, he would never have made it through Kaijuro's training exercises at all. He is kind, Mitsuri confided. She had stopped in for a quick checkup after a mission and run into Yoriichi in the hall. She'd promptly grabbed his wrist and dragged him off to sit with her on one of the porches. But that just makes him push you harder. The thought that you could die one day on a mission is very real to him. We Hashira deal with the most deadly of missions and are frequently called in when other slayers have died trying to handle the situation. Her delicate features pinched for a moment. She had to be picturing some of those missions. Yoriichi had plenty of bad memories of his own from his first life in that area. Every time he was called in after fatalities, he would always make sure the corpses made it home to their families. Every time he wondered if he could have saved any of them. Kayajuro wants to make sure you are prepared, Mitsuri continued. He figures if you hit your limits in training instead of the field, you can overcome and have a better chance to survive. That makes sense, Yoriichi said. Not that it would make Kayajuro's lessons any easier. The man's insight as a teacher helped greatly, but also meant he knew exactly what areas to push on. Mitsuri giggled and hid her face behind one hand. You really are just like Tomioka, she said. First, Shinobu, now Mitsuri. What was it with people comparing him to Tomioka? Sure, they had the same resting blank face, but their reactions weren't really that similar, were they? Remember, Mitsuri said. Being Kayajuro's Tsuguko may be hard, but it's worth it. So keep at it. Slowly, Yoriichi started to get better at both his trainings. He was consistently catching Kaneo now and evading her the entire duration of tag, not with ease, though, and there were a few times he did get caught. Training with Kayajuro did not get easier. Yoriichi simply found he recovered a little faster from each session and moved a little quicker each time. Your progress has been excellent, young Kamado, Kayajuro said, smiling. I think it is time we start adding flame-breathing forms into our training. We'll start with unknowing fire. Over the course of a week, Yoriichi came close to mastering unknowing fire. His form, Kayajuro complimented, was nearly flawless, and if he could move with just a bit more speed, he'd have it. I want you to work on that while I am gone, Kayajuro informed Yoriichi. Yoriichi nodded. He'd known Kayajuro would get back to missions sooner than he would. As a Hashira, Kayajuro had to be a fast healer. While the missions he would go on likely wouldn't be full Hashira missions yet, he could do some lighter ones as he healed. At Yoriichi's current pace, though, it would be a bit longer before he could go on regular missions, let alone accompany Kayajuro on his. Even with Kayajuro gone, though, Yoriichi still had training to do and the intensity didn't let up because his teacher was gone. In what little gaps of time he had, Yoriichi also found himself trying to talk to Kaneo or helping out Aoi. Then Shinobu cleared him for active duty and Yoriichi's own missions began to come in. Occasionally he'd be teamed up with Inosuke, but Zenitsu was gone for a while. He's in a long mission up north, Aoi told Yoriichi over laundry one morning. He's driving his comrades up a wall. Zenitsu would be pleased you are thinking about him, Yoriichi commented. Aoi screwed up her face in mock disgust. Yoriichi and Nezuko were returning to the Butterfly Mansion from a visit to a remote shrine where travelers were said to disappear. They had found the demon, an odd-looking specimen with praying mantis-like blades, and slain it. Yoriichi was particularly proud of how Nezuko had done during that job. The look of happiness on her face as he ruffled her hair was almost enough to make him smile. South, southeast, Matsuman cawed. South, southeast. Ramen shop. That last part made Yoriichi blink. Did you just say ramen shop? He asked. South, southeast, Matsuman repeated. He landed on Yoriichi's shoulder and cawed loudly into his ear. South, southeast, ramen shop. Wincing, Yoriichi rubbed his ear and set off in the direction indicated. As he went, Matsuman briefed him on the mission. Apparently, people had been disappearing on and around a train called the Mugen train. A woman with cuts all over her body had been rescued last night. She described a demon with sharp claws who began slowly slicing bits off her. Fortunately, the demon slayers on the case had interrupted the demon and she'd been rescued before too much damage had been done. You are to meet up with the demon slayer heading the mission, Matsuman told him. Now the ramen shop order almost made sense. It did make Yoriichi wonder, though, who would want to meet up at a ramen shop of all places. Stopping outside a building with a swinging sign that read, Noodles, Yoriichi heard a sound inside that gave his answer. After all, no one else he knew shouted, tasty, over his food like Tanjiro Rengoku did. Young Komado, I'm glad to see you are faring well, Tanjiro said. His voice echoed through the mostly empty noodle shop, making it even louder than usual. Master, please give this young man some of what I am having. Yorichi didn't protest. He'd learned a long time that food was serious business for Tanjiro Rengoku. Flame breathing requires stamina, which in turn requires energy and strength, Tanjiro explained to him once over a heaping platter of rice balls. Those doesn't come from nowhere. Food contributes to them a lot. So eat up, young Komado. Consider it a part of your training. So Yorichi sat down and waited patiently for his bowl of noodles. He wasn't surprised when Tanjiro ordered another bowl. For his part, the elderly cook seemed happy with the requests. Despite his gruff exterior, Yorichi could feel a quiet, kind presence coming from him. The man likely went into cooking because he loved to take care of people. It seemed he was good at it too. The steaming bowl of noodles he set in front of Yorichi nearly made his mouth water. Thank you, Yorichi said. The man grunted. Not very expressive, are you? That's fine. He then pulled out another plate. This one with some sort of rice crackers on it. In response to Tanjiro's question, the cook said it was on the house. Yorichi took a bite of his noodles and said, tasty, albeit in a flatter, quieter voice than his mentor had. I found this place a couple years back after a mission, Tanjiro said. It is one of this city's best places to eat. The master would thrive if he set a shop up in a bigger city. Not happening, the cook said. His face was now hidden behind a newspaper. The tone in his voice said this was an old argument, though. How many times had Tanjiro Rengoku come here over the years? How is business, master? Tanjiro asked. As you see, the cook said, waving a hand at the restaurant. The only other person in the room was a drunk passed out on one of the wooden tables next to his sake cup. People stopped coming out at night after talk of the slasher appearing around here started. I've even had to let my workers go. They say a conductor was murdered the other day. Now the Mugen train is out of service. According to rumor, around 40 of the passengers on board the train disappeared without any explanation. Yorichi and Tanjiro looked at each other. They both recognized it for what it was, a sign that a demon was using the train to bring new victims to itself. Was it the slasher, though, or some other demon? That sounds ominous, Tanjiro said. I am here about that train, Yorichi said. He briefed Tanjiro on the train's position and the condition of the woman he'd rescued. Tanjiro asked a few questions and then they focused on finishing their food. That done, Tanjiro paid. He tipped generously. The cook gave him a grateful nod but seemed a bit exasperated. One too many arguments in the past about Tanjiro overpaying him, probably. The cook seemed like the kind of person who didn't want to be in anyone's debt, even if Tanjiro would probably never ask for a favor. Together, they stepped out into the street. We will inspect the station where the conductor's body was found and then head for the Mugen train, Tanjiro said. The station itself was a large building with pillars holding up a gabled roof over the entrance. Normally, the wood-paneled halls would have been full of noise, even at this time of night. Train travel didn't stop because the sun went down. Today, however, all Yorichi could hear were two voices. Tanjiro angled towards them and Yorichi followed. There is no such thing as demons, a young girl's voice yelled, stop bringing that up. I've got to sell as many lunch boxes as I can. Mother is pregnant and I've heard father's shop is failing. If you talk about demons and scare all the customers away, what is our family supposed to do? Yorichi hesitated. The tone of that rant made it sound like this had been building up for a while. He wasn't sure he wanted to interfere with whatever was going on. Tanjiro ignored the tone of the voices and walked the last few steps to where the voice's owner was. The little girl wore her hair in braids and covered it with a hat. Combined with her red and white outfit, she looked oddly professional. "Good evening. Nice weather tonight, don't you think?" Tanjiro said, stopping in front of her. The girl's purple eyes went wide behind her glasses. Her brittle, warm presence flared from the shock of Tanjiro's presence. It seemed the flame Hashira didn't know the word discreet. "I am here searching for a demon. Have you seen any?" Tanjiro asked. Yorichi stiffened slightly. Demons and demon slayers were supposed to be secret from civilians. While not a hard and fast rule, it was generally understood among the demon slayer corps that, unless they had been attacked by a demon or were in danger of it, demons should not be mentioned. Another shock came from a presence, this time the old woman behind the counter the little girl sat in front of. She wore her white hair back in a bun and the same outfit as the girl minus the apron and hat. Tanjiro's eyes swiveled to her. Almost as if he too had felt the woman's familiarity. "Do you know something about it, ma'am?" Tanjiro asked. The little girl jumped and blocked Tanjiro's view of the old woman with her arms. A bun was still clasped in one of her hands. "Demons! What is wrong with you? Get out of here now. I am warning you," the girl stammered. Her arms trembled and she looked scared. No wonder. Tanjiro was practically looming over her. "Careful. If you keep shaking like that you'll drop the bean paste bun in your hand," Tanjiro said. Yorichi felt a bit of amusement in his presence even though there was none in his voice. Teasing maybe? To get the little girl to calm down. If that was the reason, Tanjiro had failed completely. Yorichi saw the muscles in the girl's arms begin to tense as she yelled, ready to throw the bun. When the little girl launched the bun, Yorichi was already in motion. He suddenly appeared beside Tanjiro, hand held out. He caught the bun in one hand and handed it to Tanjiro. The little girl's eyes were big and full of shock. The old woman looked torn between embarrassment and amazement. Both were looking at Yorichi. "Tasty!" Tanjiro shouted. Everyone turned to look at the flame Hashira who was now happily munching on the bean paste bun. "There aren't any demons here." "Everyone knows demons don't exist," the girl shouted. "Fuku," the old woman said. She put comforting hands on the girl's shoulders. Her presence exuded calm. "I don't believe his intentions are bad. Take it easy." Fuku relaxed and looked up at Rengoku, shame-faced. "I am sorry. The slasher incident have me on edge," she said. Tanjiro waved the apology away. "Let me know if I am accurate. You two work before dawn selling those tasty box lunches of yours, yes? You have my thanks. People like you should never have to worry about being in life-threatening danger." Yorichi thought of Yuta. Of the girl who wanted to catch tadpoles to have friends, but couldn't because she knew the tadpoles would be lonely apart from their families. She should never have had to face death either. "Rest assured, I will eliminate the slasher," Tanjiro promised. The girl, Fuku, stared at him. She seemed a little shell-shocked. This was all too much too fast for her. "Just who are you, mister?" she asked. Tanjiro smiled at her and then turned, Haori fluttering. "Farewell," he said. Yorichi started to turn away too, but the girl called out to them. "If you don't mind. Could you please buy a few box lunches?" Fuku asked. She looked embarrassed and Yorichi could tell it was hurting her pride to nearly beg a stranger to help her like this. "Good idea," Tanjiro said warmly. "I will buy them all." Fuku stared at him. "I didn't tell you don't have to." Tanjiro waved a hand. "It's done." He pulled out a pouch of money and dropped it on the table by the old woman, who was staring at him with as much shock as Fuku. "Will this be enough?" The old woman opened the pouch and stared at the mass of coins. All she could do was give a shaky nod. Moments later, Yorichi and Tanjiro were each weighed down by a heavy load of box lunches. Yoriichi knew better than to ask Tanjiro to give them back. The flame Hashira had heard what Fuku had said about her mother and father's financial situation just like Yoriichi had. While Yoriichi had no doubt Tanjiro would enjoy the food, the flame Hashira was more focused on protecting this little family in his own way. We'll stash a majority of these boxes in a train locker. They can be distributed among the other core members, Tanjiro said jovially. We'll keep half for ourselves, though. They can help us pose as box lunch vendors. Looking at Tanjiro's Haori and then his sword, Yoriichi doubted that lie would be convincing. If they both wore only their uniforms, they might pass. With their Haoris and swords, though, they were unlikely to be mistaken for vendors. Tanjiro chatted up the man at the ticket counter. He left the man a little shell-shocked, just like poor Fuku, but came away with information about a train heading to the same maintenance shed as the Mugen train. They located the train and hopped onto it. Tanjiro opened the cloth of the carrier holding their box lunches and Yoriichi thought at first that the Hashira was about to snack mid-mission. It wouldn't be the first time. But Tanjiro merely left the cloth open and didn't touch the box lunches. A few minutes later, a scared conductor burst into the car where they sat. Apart from Tanjiro and Yoriichi, the car was empty, so they were easy to spot. "Hey," the conductor shouted, "who are you two? What are you doing here?" Pointing to the box lunches, Tanjiro smiled. "We are box lunch vendors, as you can see. Nothing suspicious about that." The last part made Yoriichi sweat drop. For better or worse, it seemed subtly was not among Tanjiro's talents. "You do know this train is headed to a shed, right?" the conductor asked. He didn't look scared anymore. His presence felt confused. "I heard the Mugen train is there. Is that true?" Tanjiro asked. "Sorry, but that train is no longer there. It was transported to a well-equipped maintenance shed recently," the conductor said. He pointed out the window to a building whose lights glowed not that far away. Yoriichi could make out a squat building with many windows. Tanjiro gathered up the box lunches quickly and motioned for Yoriichi to follow him to the train car's door. The conductor watched them, dazed and unsure. "I see. This is where we will be getting off then." "What? Right here?" the conductor asked. Before he could question them further, Tanjiro and Yoriichi leaped off the train and onto the tracks leading to the maintenance building. "Do your best to keep up," Tanjiro told Yoriichi and then he dashed towards the building, leaving a trail of fire in his wake. Yoriichi summoned up his strength. He was fast and getting faster all the time. Tanjiro was still faster. Yoriichi trailed him by a good few yards. When he arrived at the building, Tanjiro paused for half a second for Yoriichi to catch up. Several high-arched doorways showed the trains, light from within the building. Tanjiro located the train with Mugen engraved on it and then stopped. "I will approach the demon. I will entrust the civilians to you," Tanjiro said. Yoriichi nodded. They both walked into the shed, towards the giant, shining bulk of the Mugen train. They didn't make it far before they encountered the workers. A man in a dirty white shirt and trousers eyed them as they approached. Yoriichi blocked him out and focused on the train. He could feel a presence, hungry and malevolent lingering on the train. The demon wasn't there presently, but he could feel its intention to return. "It's faint. But I can feel traces of the demon," Tanjiro said. "Do you smell it?" Slowly, Yoriichi nodded. "You know this place is off-limits, right?" the man in the dirty white shirt said. Turning, Tanjiro fixed him with a bright smile. "The Railway Bureau sent us to deliver these box lunches," Tanjiro explained. "What?" the man asked. He looked Tanjiro and then Yoriichi up and down. Then a tired look crossed his face. Yoriichi realized he wasn't fooled by Tanjiro's obvious ruse. He didn't seem to care either. "Boys," he called. This guy brought food. Soon the box lunches had been placed on a handy crates. Workers swarmed out from under the train and around stacks of crates, drawn to the food like a moth to a flame. "Take this up to Tatsu in the office," the first man said, handing a box lunch to another man in a light blue shirt. "He may still be there." "Sure," the man in the blue shirt. Kayajuro looked over at the men who now seemed completely at ease with the presence of strange men wearing swords. It seemed that food was enough to charm train workers into forgiving any amount of weirdness. "I am curious," Kayajuro said. "Why is the Mugen train here?" The first man they had spoken to gave a bitter laugh. "It's an odd situation, but word on the streets says it is a man-eating train. You don't know how bitter that make us. They need her back in service on the railways, so we need to get her up and running." The man looked her with love and admiration in his eyes. Yoriichi could see the fondness in him, even without the extra help provided by his ability to sense presences. "Just wish they gave us more time is all," the man said. "You mean it is going back into service?" Kayajuro asked, sounding surprised. "Yeah. It starts tomorrow night," the man said. He must have said something else, but Yoriichi didn't hear. A demon presence, not weak, but nowhere near 12 Kazuki level, had suddenly popped up. Yoriichi tensed and Kayajuro just had time to look over at him before the scream came. Together the two demon slayers ran around the men to the back of the maintenance building. The doors to a room with a desk and several scattered papers were wide open. The man in the light blue shirt was sitting on the ground, box lunch forgotten in the dirt beside him. A demon, human-shaped but bald with dark blue stripes over light blue skin stood with his back to them. Yoriichi could feel a shaken, dim presence coming from the man in his hands. Kayajuro released his sword hilt slightly from the sheath. The noise reached the demon and he spun around to reveal small green irises and claws dug into the chest and face of the man in his hands. "Tatsu," someone shouted. Several of the men had followed them and were now standing directly behind Yoriichi and Kayajuro. Some of them clenched their fists, a murderous look in their eyes. "Easy there," the demon said. "Stand back," Kayajuro ordered the men. He glanced at Yoriichi sending a clear message, "Protect the civilians." Yoriichi positioned himself closer to the men and Kayajuro turned his attention back to the demon. "Let him go at once," Kayajuro demanded. "A demon slayer, how annoying. And what is that stench?" The demon looked around and then located the box lunch the blue-shirt man had dropped. He crushed it under one bare, clawed foot. "I have loathed the smell of food ever since I became a demon. Just the smell of it is enough to make me want to vomit," the demon said. Kayajuro glared at the demon. "How dare you insult a box lunch made by the pure of heart? You'll pay for that," he said. It was such a bizarre remark in such a tense moment that it was almost funny. Yoriichi wasn't sure if Kayajuro was joking. The man did take his food quite seriously. "It's not my fault it smells revolting," the demon complained. "Speaking of things that are revolting. So is your blood." The demon said that last part to Tatsu as he dug his fingers harder into Tatsu's chest and face. "I devour humans that smell tasty. The rest are just my playthings. I toss them away when I grow tired of them," the demon said. There was a look in his eyes that meant trouble. Kayajuro stepped forward, distracting the demon from what he was about to do. "So that's how you work, slasher," Kayajuro said. "Despicable. Since you find me so reprehensible," the demon began. The markings on his body began to shine blue. Yoriichi saw his muscles begin to tense and shielded the men behind him. "Then do something about it." The demon became a cold blue blur as he shot around the room, victim still in hand. The men cried out and finally began to run. The demon didn't seem interested in chasing them or attacking Yoriichi. Yoriichi could see that even as he moved at high speeds, he was focused on Kayajuro. "Guess who is faster than me?" the demon chuckled. "No one." Kayajuro drew his sword and slashed at the demon, but he backflipped over the blade and out of reach. He began to taunt Kayajuro. Yoriichi started to move, but Kayajuro gave a minute shake of his head. Most of the workers were gone, however, they couldn't have gotten far away yet. Yoriichi needed to continuing blocking the shortest path the demon could take to find more victims. "Can't slash me with the kid in my arms, can you?" the demon taunted. "I can always get rid of him if he is too much trouble." The kid cried out and begged for help. "I'll save you no matter what," Kayajuro told him reassuringly. "You wouldn't think that if you saw what I did last night," the slasher said. He then related the story of the woman Kayajuro had found. Kayajuro was telling the slasher about how the woman would emerge fully healed from his attack when the last of the human presences left Yoriichi's senses. The civilians were clear. It was only the two Slayer, the demon, and the current victim. The Slayer opened his mouth, probably to say something about hurting the woman. Instead, what came out was a scream of pain. In that instant, Yoriichi had charged at the demon so fast, he seemed to disappear. With 3 quick slashes, Yoriichi freed Tatsu and left the demon covered in its own blood. Kayajuro moved in for the kill as Yoriichi and Tatsu started to flee, but the demon raced out the tunnel instead. "You Slayers think you are so smart with all your secrets, but I still know how to hit you where it hurts. The people who made those box lunches. You seem to care about them especially. They are the next ones I'll pay a visit to. If you want to play hero, get to the station before me," the slasher yelled. Kayajuro stood over Yoriichi and Tatsu. "Lower him to the ground," Kayajuro instructed. Yoriichi slowly put Tatsu on the ground. The young man's eyes were shut so tight his brow was scrunched. His teeth clenched in pain. The presence of the men re-entered Yoriichi's senses as he reached for a piece of cloth nearby and pressed it to the wound on Tatsu's chest. The white fabric gained a scarlet bloom of blood. Kayajuro knelt beside him with another strip of cloth, tying it tightly over the first fabric as a sort of bandage. "You can save him, right?" one of the men asked. Looking over, Yoriichi noticed his features and presence were similar to Tatsu's. If they weren't father and son, they had to at least be older and younger brother. "Leave it to me and my apprentice," Kayajuro said. "We'll save him. Our comrades will soon be here to help out." As if on cue, Kayajuro's crow flew into the building with several junior-level demon slayers behind it. "Lord Rengoku," one of the slayers said, inclining his head. "Tanjirou Komado. Medical?" Kayajuro asked. "On their way," the same slayer replied. She seemed to be the leader of the small party. "We've done what we can for him," Kayajuro said, standing up. "He is yours now." Kayajuro signaled for Yoriichi to follow him. Yoriichi stood up and stopped for a moment, assessing the man. "Keep an eye on his chest wound," Yoriichi said. "When medical gets here, tell them to stitch him up before moving him. One of the claw marks is close to a lung and we don't want to tear it any wider." "Understood," the female demon slayer said. Yoriichi could feel Kayajuro's eyes on him, quietly assessing. Then Kayajuro smiled and said, "There's no time to waste. Follow me as best you can." Kayajuro ran out onto the tracks with Yoriichi close behind. When they reached it, Kayajuro gathered himself and then sprinted down the track so fast, he left what felt like flames in his wake. His movement now was far faster than it had been earlier when there had been no need for speed. Now, it was all Yoriichi could do to keep within 20 yards of Kayajuro. Within moments, Yoriichi could feel the slasher along with 2 terrified presences, Fuku and her grandmother. Kayajuro suddenly sped up in front of him and hit something like a battering ram. A human-like shape flew off to one side. It took Yoriichi a moment to recognize the slasher. Yoriichi caught sight of a red kimono and braids before Kayajuro shifted and blocked Fuku from view. "You're not hurt, are you?" Kayajuro asked. "My grandma," Fuku said shakily. "Where is she?" Yoriichi looked around and mentally cursed his sloppiness. The demon had snuck inside the train station while Yoriichi had been distracted with Fuku. Hurling himself inside the building, Yoriichi came upon the slasher approaching Fuku's grandmother, who had fallen to the ground, shaking slightly in terror. He leaped over the demon and stood with his sword raised. The demon snarled. Then Kaijuro walked into the doorway and the demon's wrath turned to him. "How did you catch up to me?" it demanded. Kaijuro put a hand on the hilt of his sheath sword. "I did warn you not to get too arrogant," Kaijuro said. The demon snarled and then his sharp teeth stretched wide in a manic grin. "How about a little contest, then? I win if I can tear out your apprentice's heart and slash the old hag's throat open. You win if you sever my head before I can do either." A warrior's smile split Kaijuro's face. Even as he spoke, Yoriichi could see muscles bunching, lungs compressing, readying themselves for a single stupendous burst. "I accept your challenge." "Best of luck to you," Kaijuro said. Then in half an instant, he had crossed the gap between himself and the demon. His next words came as he slashed the demon's head from its shoulders in one stroke from Flame Breathing's first form. "I win." The old woman stared in shock. Her presence felt dazed yet full of a strange recognition. Her eyes filled with tears and she choked back sobs. "You. I remember you now. You have saved us before. I know it. Your face and that bright Haori, how could I have forgotten them?" Fuku crouched by her grandmother who was crying freely. "What are you saying?" Fuku asked. Please forgive me," the old woman said. "You saved my life before now. Her mother and I would have been killed 20 years ago if not for you." "I still don't know what you mean," Fuku said. Yoriichi had to agree that it didn't make sense. He hadn't asked Kaijuro's age, but the flame Hashira could not have been over 30 at the outside. A sudden shock in Kaijuro's presence made Yoriichi look in his direction. There was a gentle swirling to his presence. A strange mix of happiness and wistfulness. "You are speaking of my father," Kaijuro said. "I followed in his footsteps by becoming the flame Hashira. Protecting you just as he did is an honor." For a moment, there was silence. The old woman stared at Kaijuro, tears still running from her eyes and down her cheek to drip onto the floor. Yoriichi watched. Unsure if he was supposed to comfort the woman or stand back and let Fuku or Kaijuro help her. What was he supposed to do in situations like this? Thankfully for Yoriichi, Fuku dropped to the floor on her knees and let out an "umph." "I still have trouble believing it. Demons exist. I am sorry I ever doubted you, Grandma." Kaijuro laughed, the sound echoing brightly off the wooden station walls. "You should be able to live your life without being afraid, especially of demons." Fuku smiled. Several of the Kikuchi rushed in. They approached Fuku and her grandmother to check them over for injuries. "The demon is gone and we have prevailed," Kaijuro said to Yoriichi. "Now for the Mugen train. The maintenance work will be done tonight, meaning that it will return tomorrow." In spite of the incident, the train company would still force its workers to keep to schedule. Yoriichi wondered if the same men who saw their friend nearly die would be the ones to finish the repairs. Would the company send out new workers to take over or help them finish? He remembered the look of pride on that one man's face as he spoke about the repairs and hoped they didn't. Demon attack or not, those men needed a bit of normalcy back in their lives. "The demon on that train isn't gone, is it?" Yoriichi asked. Kaijuro gave him that same intense look he'd worn at the warehouse after Yoriichi diagnosed exactly what Tatsu's greatest injuries were. "Why would you say that?" "The demon's," Yoriichi almost said presence, smell wasn't right. He didn't smell bloody enough or seem powerful enough to have eaten over 40 humans. For a moment, Kaijuro said nothing, then he nodded. "You are correct, young Kamadu. The slasher was too easy an opponent to have eaten 40 humans. Demons that strong are on an entirely different level of power." He looked thoughtful and then said, "Young Komado, can you tell me why the slasher was here in the same area as a demon that powerful?" Kaijuro's tone was serious and he seemed focused. This was a test of some kind. One where Yoriichi's answer would matter greatly. "It is not a coincidence," Yoriichi said. "Demons are territorial by nature. A demon with over 40 kills would be strong enough to keep a demon like the slasher out of its territory or kill it for daring to enter. That means the demon still living let the slasher stay in its territory. The only reason I can think of for that is so that the weaker demon would serve as cannon fodder. Instead of surprising and killing the stronger demon, we kill the slasher and either think we have found our threat and leave or announce our presence to the stronger demon." A nod. "Well put, young Komado. You have summed up the situation well. So well that I am curious how you learned demons were so territorial. I haven't explained that to you yet and you do not have the experience to make such judgments." Beneath his blank expression, Yoriichi mentally flinched. The answer had been so natural to him that he'd forgotten to hold back on his demon knowledge. "I learned through observation," Yoriichi said. "The only demons on Mount Natagumo were the ones lower 5 controlled. The entertainment district was empty of any demons save for Daki and Jutaro. It makes sense that the reason for it is that demons are territorial and the more powerful ones use their abilities to keep others out." Thinking back, Yoriichi remembered what Tamayo said about Musen's fear of demons banding together to revolt. Was that why demons were so territorial? Because Musen wanted them to be? Kaijuro's intense expression broke into one of his bright smiles. "You are indeed observant." Yoriichi nodded his thanks, watching Kaijuro for a moment to see if the Hashira still seemed suspicious of him. Kaijuro's smile gave him no hints. "We will be going on the Mugen train today. The demon is probably still aboard that train and ready to strike at any moment." Kaijuro and Yoriichi left the train station. They each made their preparations in their own ways then returned to the station at dusk. On entering the station, the first people they ran into were Fuku and her grandmother. Yoriichi watched and barely avoiding sweat dropping as Kaijuro enthusiastically bought more box lunches. When they got on the train, Yoriichi and Kaijuro were each lugging a large bag of box lunches. They seated themselves in the train and Kaijuro took out one of the box lunches. He took a bite and his "tasty" rang out through the entire train car. "Eat, young Komado. Keeping up one's strength is very important," Kaijuro said, pushing several box lunches into Yoriichi's lap. With Kaijuro, when it came to food, protesting was useless. Yoriichi had learned that long ago. Once, he'd been beyond stuffed and tried to refuse the plate of food Kaijuro dumped in front of him. "You need endurance," Kaijuro had lectured him. "And that means fuel and that means food. Eat up, young Komado. Consider it an official part of your training." "Young Komado," Kaijuro began when Yoriichi was halfway through a box lunch. "I have been meaning to ask you something." The words nearly sent a chill down Yoriichi's spine. He thought back to the moment with Tatsu, his too perfect answer to Kaijuro's question at the station. Kaijuro didn't suspect, did he? "That Kagura dance you mentioned. How old do you think it is?" Yoriichi looked over at Kaijuro, feeling surprised. Of all the questions to ask. "Pretty old," Yoriichi said with a shrug. "My father said he was taught the dance by his father who was taught by his father. The tradition stretches back as far as anyone can remember. There are no records of it in the Komado family." He was glad about that. If Sumiyoshi had passed down Yoriichi's entire history along with the dance, Yoriichi wasn't sure how he would have felt. "I read something once," Kaijuro continued. "In the Flame Hashira Chronicles, there is a description of a breath user. One of the earliest ones. He was said to use a form of breathing that produced fire and heat, but wasn't flame breathing." Yoriichi nodded and fought the urge to tense. "I don't remember any more about it," Kaijuro said. It has been a long time since I read it. Perhaps, when this mission is over, we can visit the Flame Estate and I can check again. Flame Hashira Chronicles. Kasajiri never mentioned keeping any kind of record. That didn't mean he hadn't, though, and if the records mentioned sun-breathing it would suddenly get much harder to hide what he was. Already, there were moments he thought Kaijuro suspected something was off. With an actual name and description, Yoriichi's secret might be outed. But maybe it was better that way. Drifting upwards, Yoriichi's eyes settled for a half an instant on the spots where the marks on Kaijuro's forehead and face had been. He owed Kaijuro an explanation. Maybe he should. A loud cackle interrupted Yoriichi's thoughts. A high-pitched shriek followed closely on its heels. I forgot to mention, Kaijuro said. 2 more slayers have been assigned to our mission. Master thought it best for them to be ones we were familiar with. It sounds like they are here. Yoriichi nearly smiled as the door to the train car flung open and Inosuke rushed through with Zenitsu dragging behind, already wailing. Zenitsu, Inosuke, Yoriichi said. I am glad to see you are doing well. Well, Zenitsu sniffled. He ran over to Yoriichi and grabbed his arm. I am not doing well. We had to run to catch this train. It was already moving and I almost tripped and got crushed. Then that idiot Inosuke goes, I'm gonna challenge this thing to a race and dandened. It was so awful, Tanjiro. I didn't say I'd race some thing, Inosuke said, putting as much disgust into the word thing as his voice and mask would allow. I said I'd race this master of the land we are on. I aim to do it too. Inosuke opened the window and poked his head out. Immediately, Zenitsu raced over to him, pulling on his shoulders to hold him back from going out the window. Yoriichi rose to help and nearly tripped over all the empty box lunches he and Kaijuro had created. A pair of maids gave painful smiles and then took the empty lunches and began trying to shove them into a garbage bag. The maids cleared out of the way and Yoriichi saw that Zenitsu had actually managed to pull Inosuke back from the window. You'll break the glass, idiot, Zenitsu wailed. They'll be fine, Kaijuro said. It is just high spirits. Personally, Yoriichi disagreed. He did trust, however, that Inosuke's instincts were strong enough to keep him from actually leaping from a moving train. The Boar Slayer wasn't an idiot. Just loud and eccentric. Young Kamado, Kaijuro said. I do not think we have ever discussed your sword color before, have we? For the second time that night, Yoriichi was caught off guard. Well, no. My sword is black. There isn't much to discuss, Yoriichi admitted. But there is, Kaijuro said, looking at Yoriichi. Nichiren blades turn color according to the breathing style you favor. The boy of yellow had a yellow blade because he uses thunder breathing. The young boar has a unique shade because he favors his own unique style. My own is red after the color of a flame. Tell me. Why do you think your own blade has never turned blue? Yoriichi blinked. Blue. Blue is the color all water breathers share, Kaijuro confirmed. The shade may vary from slayer to slayer, but it is always blue. You were primarily using water breathing when I met you, yet your blade has stayed black. Why do you think that is? For a moment, Yoriichi thought about it. Saying, because my blade was black in my previous life, obviously wasn't an option here. Because I don't know what style to master. Yoriichi guessed. Kaijuro shook his head. Your blade has not changed color because you have not yet chosen a style yet. I believe that you can change that. With plenty of time and focus, you can change its color. Maybe even make it turn red with enough flame breathing. Yoriichi thought back to the red blade from his previous life. It wasn't the same shade as Kaijuro's blade. That red only happened during battle, when the metal was superheated. The base, however, had always been black. What if I do not want to pick a breath style yet? Yoriichi asked. That's fine, Kaijuro said. Fine. Yoriichi echoed. Of course, Tanjiro said, smiling. Finding the style that works for you, the way you are meant to fit into it all. That isn't something that can or should be rushed. I have faith you will find it in time. He meant it too. Yoriichi could feel it in that open, warming presence. Tanjiro wasn't Kasajiri and never would be, but maybe they could still be friends one day. The thought pleased him and filled him with dread. Zenitsu, Inosuke, Ju, Urkadaki, Kaneo, Aoi, Sumi, Naho, Kiyo and now possibly Tanjiro. His list of friends was growing and with it, the number of people he could lose. Last time, his life was this full, fate began to take them. He promised himself it wouldn't this time. Inosuke had the window open again and Zenitsu was straining to keep the boy from jumping out it. Between Zenitsu's wails and Inosuke's loud yelling about races, they were attracting a lot of attention from the other passengers. I wouldn't leave this train, Tanjiro told Inosuke. Who knows when a demon might appear? That startled Inosuke and Zenitsu into silence. The furtive glances of the other passengers turned to Tanjiro for a moment. Yoriichi could hear words like strange and crazy being whispered. You don't mean, Zenitsu asked trembling, that demons show up on this train? Yes, they do, Tanjiro replied. Zenitsu gave a shriek of despair. Weren't you told the details of the mission when you got it? Yoriichi asked. What are you talking about? You know I don't understand a word that Sparrow says, Zenitsu wailed. Inosuke's crow was no help either. It just told us the direction and to get on the train to meet up with you guys. I thought we were traveling towards the demon, not stuck on the train with it. First chance I get, I'm getting off. Over 40 people went missing from this train in a short period. Several swordsmen have been sent in, but they have all vanished. That is why I am here and why the rest of you are here to back me up. The demon on this train may be powerful. We'll need to work together as we did in the entertainment district. I am sure we will prevail as we did there. Zenitsu stared at Tanjiro for a moment and then began to sob and scream. The door to the car slid open and Yoriichi got a faint whiff of demon presence. He looked over his shoulder to see a man in a navy uniform with a pale, haggard face. The whiff came from him, but wasn't strong enough for him to be a demon. A quick check in the transparent world confirmed the man was human. Tickets, the man mumbled. Tickets please. Tanjiro followed the direction of Yoriichi's gaze and nodded. That man there is going to make sure your ticket is valid, he said. Yoriichi thought about telling Tanjiro about the trace of demon, but decided to wait until the man had gone. They could find him later and ask if he had seen the demon. Tanjiro handed out his ticket and the man punched it, then handed it back. Surprisingly, a still weeping Zenitsu and a now seated Inosuke handed tickets to the man as well. The man turned to Yoriichi, the last person in the car without his ticket punched. Slowly. Yoriichi held it out, trying to get a read on the demon presence. It was stronger now and definitely nearby, but where? The man punched Yoriichi's ticket and handed it back. Yoriichi blinked and the demon presence suddenly grew much stronger. Like it was somehow already in the car. Tanjiro must have sensed it as well. He stood up, apologizing to the conductor, and facing the direction the presence was strongest in. The conductor didn't seem to hear Tanjiro. He simply stood in place, looking down at the floor. The other passengers seemed a bit nervous, but not overly frightened. Most weren't even looking at Tanjiro, having decided the strange man with the sword was not quite entertainment enough for them. The demon appeared at the end of the car, all five eyes glaring, jaws clenched tight in hatred. That was strange. Yoriichi hadn't felt its presence become stronger or seen anything through the transparent world before it entered. Before Yoriichi could stop and think about that, the demon stood up and Tanjiro started speaking. Such a giant. Yet you were so difficult to detect, Tanjiro said, putting a hand on his sword hilt. You bare your fangs against the innocent. So I will turn your bones to ash with my bright red blade of fire. With those dramatic words, Tanjiro and the demon sprang into near simultaneous action. The demon gave a roar and sprang forward. Tanjiro charged forward to meet it, slicing his sword through Flame Breathing's first form. The bright red blade sheared through its target and the demon's head went flying. The head and the rest of the body burst into ash. Yoriichi blinked. That seemed wrong. Demons didn't normally do that so quickly, did they? He found himself struggling to recall if they did. Before he could ask Tanjiro about it, a second demon, this time with limbs like a spider, appeared at the opposite end of the train from the first. Most of the other passengers had fled, but there was one more man who remained frozen in shock. The demon was close to him. Inosuke let out a battle cry and leaped at it. The demon swatted at Inosuke. Inosuke blocked the hit but was sent flying at the remaining bystander. Suddenly, Tanjiro was there, scooping the man into his arms and running. Inosuke hit the seat the bystander had been close to hard. He was dazed slightly, but unhurt. Tanjiro escorted the bystander to the back of the car and told him to run. The man did, not giving his rescuers so much as a glance. We can fight without holding back now, Tanjiro said. He rushed forward and cut the demon's head off with Flame Breathing's second form, a sweeping upward slash. The demon's head flew off and the demon dissolved. Once again, it did it too quickly. It was wrong. Somehow it was wrong. The train disappeared and suddenly Yoriichi found himself on a wooded mountain top, facing a familiar house. A house Yoriichi had last seen filled with corpses and blood. As he stared in disbelief, the door opened and a pair of children came running out into the snow. "Brothers back home," Hanako yelled. Her shoes crunched in the snow, her haori flowing behind her as she ran at him, arms open wide for a hug. Shigeru was right behind her, face split by a wide grin. Yoriichi barely had time to set his feet before Hanako was on him, nearly knocking him over with the force of her enthusiasm. Shigeru hit Yoriichi right as he was steadying, making Yoriichi wobble. "Welcome home, Tanjiro," Shigeru said, his voice muffled against Yoriichi's shirt. "Did you sell the charcoal?" Hanako asked. Yoriichi said nothing. For a moment, he just held his siblings, feeling their warmth, the life flowing through their veins. Then, for the first time in a long time, Yoriichi began to cry. He gave no explanation, made no real sound. Simply let the feelings of grief and intense longing wash through him in those wordless, quiet cries. Later Yoriichi sat quietly and listened as Hanako related the story of how her big brother, who never cried, not even when their father had to dig out that humongous splinter 2 years ago, had suddenly burst into tears. Predictably, Takeo gave a lopsided grin and started making fun of Yoriichi for it. His mother, Ki, gave him a worried once-over. "It could be you are exhausted," Ki said. Yoriichi shook his head. "I'm fine," he said. He meant it too. Sitting in this room, with all his siblings around him and his mother in front of him. It all felt like a dream because... Suddenly, Yoriichi's head felt fuzzy and wrong. Because what? This was what every day was like. Nothing was different here from the usual. So why did he feel so grateful for it all? Shaking his head, Yoriichi tried to puzzle it out. He was interrupted when Shigeru grabbed a sheet and threw it over his head. The other children giggled and protested. Yoriichi let the sensation of calm wash back over him and decided the answers weren't so important after all. Later on, as Yoriichi was playing with Rokuta, he felt another strange sensation. Like there was a stranger nearby watching him. There was a specific way to search for them without tipping them off, but how did he do? Ki spoke up and talked about making rice crackers, one of his favorite foods. The other children chimed in and soon everyone was agreeing to make them together. Yoriichi forgot all about strangers and ways of searching for them. Behind a tree not far from the house, a boy with brown hair and chalky white skin listened to the laughter and the voices within. He'd taken a gamble a few moments ago and peeked inside to see a younger, softer version of the dreamer playing with a younger child. The dreamer's gaze had suddenly sharpened and the intruder had dashed back to behind his tree, terrified he had been discovered. A few more minutes passed without the dreamer striding out and demanding to know why the intruder was there. The boy relaxed and his knees started to shake. Not from the cold, though there was snow all around him and his thin red kimono was not up to the task of keeping him warm. It wasn't even fear of the dreamer discovering him that made the boy's limbs tremble. No. The boy's legs shook because he was beginning to doubt. The dream Grantaire had said the realm they found themselves in would be where the dreamer felt most happy, the most safe. The subconscious was an image of what the dreamer wished for the most in all the world. What this boy wished for the most, then, was his family. The intruder shook his head. For the dreamer to want only his family, he couldn't be that bad a person, could he? If what he wanted in all the world was to be with the ones he loved, then why should he have to die? The intruder's legs continued to shake as he fought against the weight of his doubts. Eventually, the intruder stopped shaking and lifted his head. After another glance at the house to make sure the dreamer was not looking, he began to run away from the house to look for the edges of the dream. It didn't matter whether or not the dreamer deserved to die. The intruder's own dreams were as valid as the dreamer's. The intruder thought of the prize he was seeking, freedom. Freedom from the chain on his neck that was slowly squeezing the life out of him. From the frail prison his body had become since the first moment his own blood stained his lips. The intruder ran for hours, unsure of his direction, but sure that the forest and the mountain had to end at some point. At last, he ran smack into an invisible wall. His back slammed into the hard, icy ground and he lay there for a moment, breath hissing out of him in steaming clouds like a smoke from a train's engine. Then the intruder stood up and walked forward slowly, hands outspread. When his hands encountered that invisible wall, he pulled out the strange weapon the Dream Master had given him. It was like a stubby, round stick with a long sharp needle in the center. As he stabbed the wall and ripped through it with the tool, the intruder thought of what would happen to the dreamer. The Dream Master had promised that it would all be painless. That the dreamer would simply go on living in the dream for eternity. It had offered the same reward to the intruder and the others in his group. Truthfully, the intruder wasn't sure the Dream Master was right. Destroying a spiritual core sounded like death to him. But maybe, just maybe it was possible to live in a dream forever. If that was so, then the intruder might be freeing the dreamer as well as himself. With these thoughts, the intruder stepped through the colorful rip he had created in the air and into a different world. In a different part of the woods, Yoriichi felt an odd sensation of wrongness as he shouldered his basket of wood. Like a sound had physically cut across in the crisp, clean air surrounding him. He looked around, but saw only trees, the crisp cuts from where he had hewn wood from trunks, and his axe. Nothing appeared out of place. "What do you think, Nezuko?" Yoriichi asked the basket on his shoulder. "Do you think something feels wrong as well?" The basket didn't reply and Yoriichi turned his head to see it was just a basket of wood. Where had Nezuko's box gone? For a moment, Yoriichi searched in a panic, trying frantically to remember where he had left it. If someone opened that box in daylight then Nezuko would. A numbness crept over Yoriichi's panicked thoughts, muffling them like the snow did his own footfalls. He tried to remember why Nezuko would be in a box and what daylight had to do with any of it. Where was Nezuko? Trooping back to the house with his basket of wood, Yoriichi began to feel uneasy. He hadn't seen Nezuko since he'd gotten back from wherever he had been before. That place he couldn't seem to remember that made him miss everyone so much. Why did he keep having these strange thoughts? Why did his mind keep returning to a place that must have been so horrible? Sliding open the door, Yoriichi entered to find Kei at the stove in their small kitchen. She welcomed him and he set the basket of wood down by the door. Entering the main living area, he found his siblings squabbling as usual. Takeo was saying something to Hanako, a teasing note his voice. Hanako stood with her hands on her hips and her face indignant. Scanning the room, Yoriichi found there was one person missing and his unease grew. "Where is Nezuko?" he asked. "She went up the mountain a little ways to pick vegetables for dinner tonight," Takeo answered. "She couldn't have." Yoriichi thought. "It's broad daylight and she what? Why was daylight a problem for her again and why was his head aching so much?" "Is something wrong?" Hanako asked him. "You look like you are going to be sick." "I am fine," Yoriichi said distractedly. He tried to think more about Nezuko and sunlight, but his mother asked him to get water for the bath. Putting the questions aside for the moment, he grabbed 2 wooden buckets and started towards the stream a little ways down the mountain from the house. Reaching the stream, Yoriichi bent down and started to scoop the bucket through the water, then caught sight of his reflection and froze. His reflection was different from how he looked. In the reflection, his hair was longer and in a high ponytail. The scar across his forehead was vivid and looked like a flame. "Open your eyes," his reflection said. Yoriichi nearly dropped the bucket. "What?" "You need to open your eyes and see," the reflection said urgently. "We have done this before. Tried to live in a fantasy. To stay where everything is perfect. Last time, we waited until it was too late. We can't do that this time. You have to open your eyes and wake up." But Yoriichi's eyes were already open, there was nothing else he could. Suddenly he remembered. The way he could look for Nezuko, what he had been struggling to remember this entire time. The transparent world. His head pounded so hard it felt like it would break, but Yoriichi focused on his eyes, on seeing the transparent world. The world around him disappeared like it had never been. He found himself sitting on something with 7 people and 1 demon presence around him. One of the 7 was bigger and brighter than the others and held aloft a smaller, menacing presence. It all made sense then. A dream. All of this was a dream. The transparent world did not show the world he was in because the world he was in did not exist anywhere, but in his own head. What he was seeing was the train. The place his body had fallen asleep. But why were there more presences around him than there had been earlier, and why did some of them feel malevolent? Closing his eyes, Yoriichi returned his sight to normal and regarded the dream world around him. He could remain here. Pretend he didn't know it was all a pretty lie and let the demon have him. It wouldn't be the worst way to die. In all likelihood, it was better than whatever fate had planned for him. He might not even be letting Kibutsuji win in the end. What was the likelihood that he, who hadn't managed to kill the Demon King back when he was much stronger and much faster, was going to kill Kibutsuji? Then he thought about his friends and how they would likely die along with him. He pictured Nezuko, scared and alone. Ragged and feral, unable to keep herself from eating people. No, he couldn't die here. That meant he had to break out of this dream somehow. The question was how. The intruder stood frozen in shock. The air around him was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing winds and biting cold he had just come from. The sky above was a light, almost delicate blue with small wisps of clouds decorating it. The light from the sun was soft and the warmth caressed his chilled body, wrapping him as if in a soft blanket. In front of him was a house with a wide porch and a grand sweeping roof. The style of the columns and the doors was ancient. Yet the house was immaculate. Its walls fairly shining in the sun. The intruder had never seen anything like it. The house, however, is not what had the intruder staring. It was the little boy sitting on the porch who commanded his attention. The little boy looked almost like the dreamer. He had thick reddish, black hair and a scar on his forehead. The boy wore the same earrings as the dreamer and had the same blank expression. But there was something about his eyes. They seemed unfocused, as if the boy was looking at more than just what was in front of him. The boy wore a red kimono and no shoes. In his hands was a wooden sword. The intruder continued to stare. Had he been found out? Had the dreamer somehow made it into his own subconscious ahead of the intruder? Are you lost? The boy asked. The intruder jerked slightly, surprised at being spoken to. The boy did not seem confused by the gesture. He waited patiently and the intruder realized that the boy was looking for a response. The intruder began. Well, yes. I think so. The boy nodded and stood up. The intruder flinched, waiting for the boy to raise that wooden sword and strike at him. The boy had to be some kind of guardian. Once he knew what the intruder was there for, he would attack. The intruder knew himself and his body. He would never be able to hold off a determined attacker. The boy turned and looked over his shoulder. Follow me. We'll get you back to where you need to be, he said. The boy headed off around the side of the building. After a moment of hesitation, the intruder followed. Behind the building was a beautiful meadow. Flowers bloomed in bright pops of purple, pink, blue, and yellow. The grass felt more like a soft carpet underneath his feet. The sun's gentle light seemed to be gathered together in the middle of the meadow into a single floating orb. The orb was so bright, it hurt to look at it. Its iridescent sheen mimicked that of a jewel. Without a doubt, it was what the intruder had come to destroy, the dreamer's spiritual core. The intruder took a shaky step back and looked at the boy who was calmly watching him through those cloudy reddish-brown eyes. There was no condemnation in them. No sign of anger or malice. The boy knew what the intruder wanted, that the intruder planned on killing him yet still hadn't attacked. Why? The intruder whispered. Why would you bring me here? You are lost, the boy said simply. But you know what I came here to do, the intruder shouted. He felt irrationally angry now. At this boy who was risking his own life for no other reason than to help a stranger. I came here to destroy it. To kill you. Do you want to die? The boy tilted his head slightly. You won't do it, the boy said. You are not evil. You are lost. This time when the boy repeated his claim that the intruder was lost, the intruder understood. He'd been so focused on his own freedom. On finding a way to make the pain go away that he'd forgotten everything else and everyone else. He'd forgotten his own identity as a human along the way as well and agreed to do unforgivable things. He was lost and killing the dreamer wouldn't help him find himself again. The intruder dropped his weapon and started to cry. I am sorry, he said. Sorry. So sorry. A small hand slid into his and he looked up to see the boy gripping his hand. I think we should sit down, the boy said. The intruder nodded numbly and soon he was seated on the porch next to the boy. He told the boy everything. About his family and the illness that killed his grandfather. How one day he discovered he too had the illness. The way everything fell apart as he tried and failed to do the simplest things. The misery he'd felt until a strange man had shown him a dream and promised to take all the pain away. The boy listened to all of it without comment or judgment. His strangely gentle gaze somehow comforting to the intruder. Without a single stroke of his sword, the boy had disarmed his opponent and converted him. The intruder would remember this moment as the one that changed his entire life. Outside of the subconscious, Yoriichi was sitting in his house, listening to his siblings bicker and trying to figure out how to end the dream. He tried willing himself to wake up and then slapped himself. Neither method made the dream so much as flicker. Yoriichi found himself surrounded by a familiar magenta fire. His siblings cried out in surprise, calling out to make sure he was okay. Nezuko, Yoriichi thought. Looking through the transparent world, he saw her standing in front of him with both hands on her head. Faintly, he could smell blood. Nezuko was hurt. Yoriichi stood up. He had to find a way out of his dream now. Nezuko needed him. Feeling a familiar weight down at his hip, Yoriichi looked down to see that he wore his Demon Slayer sword now, along with his uniform. I must be waking up, Yoriichi realized. What happened? one of Yoriichi's siblings asked. We were really scared for you. All that fire. Are you all right? Yoriichi looked at them. At sweet Hanako and mischief-loving Takeo. At Rokuta, the baby of the family who always tried his best to keep up. He missed them. Missed them so much. But he couldn't stay with them in this illusion. Not when Nezuko needed him. I am sorry, Yoriichi said, and then he left the house and began to run. As he hurtled through the trees and down the slope, Yoriichi did not know where he was going. Except that he was going away. Away from his illusionary family and his illusionary home. Is the demon in this dream? Yoriichi thought. That could be how I escape the dream. I have to kill it. But his senses gave him no clue as to the demon's location. The demon's presence suffused the dream, surrounding him in an endless cloud of energy. The transparent world was of no help either. Not when he was tracking down an illusion. I have to do this, Yoriichi thought. I must find a way out of this dream. For Nezuko. Who knows what she is facing? Where are you going, Tanjiro? Nezuko asked. Yoriichi skidded to a halt on the snow and turned around. Nezuko stood there. Soft, whole and completely human. She wore her hair tucked up and a puzzled expression on her open face. In her hands was a basket with vegetables in it. The sight sent a pang through Yoriichi's heart. Here it was. The end of all of his searching and fighting. Nezuko, human and happy, with no trace of her former demon self. It was an illusion. Yoriichi knew it to be. That didn't stop the longing that flooded him. The desire to stop and stay in a world where he no longer had to fight. He went this way, a child's voice yelled. Hurry, Mom. Brother needs our help. It seemed the rest of the family had caught up to Yoriichi. Either he hadn't run as far and fast as he thought or the dream was starting to disregard the laws of physics. Regardless, before Yoriichi was a tempting scene. His family, all gathered together in one place with no concern bigger than Yoriichi's own strange actions. He knew that he could keep it that way. All he had to do was stop struggling, to let the dream pull him under and drown him. That was when Yoriichi realized what he had to do. To live, he would have to let go of his dreams of the past. He would need to leave them behind. Yoriichi slowly turned away from his family and then began to run. They cried out after him and Yoriichi could even see them stumbling after him, chasing him. He sped up, crashing heedlessly through the forest without direction. Knowing only that he had to get away from them before they dragged him back down. Finally, after what felt like an age of running, the voices faded and Yoriichi found himself alone in the forest. The dream did not seem to have an edge to run off. It seemed endless. Frustrated, Yoriichi stopped to catch his breath. He had to figure out a way out of his dream soon. Before his fake family appeared again. Ignoring Rokuta's cries, Hanako's pleas, and Takeo's shouts had been hard enough the first time. Enduring a second round of that would be worse than torture. He'd almost rather kill himself. Yoriichi's instincts went wild at that last thought. Kill himself. Kill himself. Wasn't there an old wives' tale about how dreamers always woke up when they died in dreams? Unsheathing his sword, Yoriichi stared at his reflection in the black blade. Everything felt so real in this dream. Would cutting himself hurt? Would it feel like it would in the real world? Slowly, Yoriichi raised his blade and started to swing it upwards towards his throat. The answer to those questions didn't matter. He knew only one thing, Nezuko needed him to wake up from the dream now. If he had to endure the pain of dying to do it, then so be it. The tip connected with the flesh of his throat and sliced through it in a thin, white-hot line of pain. Stars wheeled in Yoriichi's vision and he suddenly couldn't draw in air anymore. He collapsed to the snowy ground, his blood spurting out to stain the ground. The pain was so great and the panic from not being able to breathe so strong, that Yoriichi's eyes clenched shut. When he opened them, his vision was filled with Nezuko's concerned face. He sat up so quickly that he almost bumped Nezuko's head with his own. Looking Nezuko over, Yoriichi sighed in relief. No sign of any injuries. Whatever injury she had suffered must have been small and accidental. There was no demon trying to crush her. With his concern over Nezuko addressed, Yoriichi took a deep breath and then looked around. There were 4 new people in the car, all of them relatively young. They were bound to each of the others with ropes that stank of demon, except for the 4th whose rope end was burned. Looking down at his wrist, Yoriichi could see a bit of burned rope tied around it. Everyone appeared to be asleep, including the new people and the other passengers in their car. The demon has them trapped in dreams of their own, Yoriichi realized. It must be powerful to use its blood demon art on this many people and still remain so potent. Then there are the 4 new people. What are they doing with ropes suffused with demon power? Based on Kaijuro's pose, he was currently choking the woman bound to him by a rope. It was something antagonistic. Either way, the ropes were bad news. He wanted to cut them but was unsure of how to do so safely. The burned edges of the rope on his wrist caught Yoriichi's eye. The burns were likely from Nezuko's flames. She must have bled on purpose to ignite him and burn away the demon's influence so he could wake up. Nezuko, could you burn the ropes off the others? Yoriichi asked. Nezuko's eyes lit up and she scuttled over to the rope binding Zenitsu. Raising her hands, she squinted at the rope and it burst into magenta flame. The flames quickly ate through the rope and she moved on to Inosuke. Yoriichi shook Zenitsu and called his name. The boy stayed limp and unresponsive, still too deeply asleep for Yoriichi to wake him. Shaking Inosuke and Kaijuro was no different. They would wake up in time. Yoriichi promised himself that they would, but how long it would be was unknown. Nezuko had just finished burning away the last ropes and Yoriichi was patting her on the head in praise, when his instincts shouted at him to move. Grabbing Nezuko, Yoriichi spun around to see the woman Kaijuro had been choking, leaping at him with an odd pointed weapon slashing at his throat. Yoriichi spun away and the woman charged past him. Turning, she raised the weapon again, eyes wild. Was the demon controlling her? The woman opened her mouth and said, "Stop interfering. We are not going to have happy dreams now and it is all your fault." Yoriichi blinked. What did burning away those ropes have to with happy dreams? The woman who had been tied to Inosuke stood up and so did the boy who'd been tied to Zenitsu. All 3 menaced Yoriichi with sharp iron spikes protruding from wooden handles. Their presences do not feel surrounded by demonic power. What they are doing now is of their own free will. Yoriichi realized. Then he thought about what the woman had said about happy dreams and decided there was more than one way for a demon to control a human. This demon had apparently found a way outside of direct influence. The thought made Yoriichi's blood begin to heat. The first woman, the one in the green kimono, looked at the man who had been attached to Yoriichi and demanded he stand up and help. "I don't care if you have tuberculosis. I'll tell him if you do not do your job and then he will not show you any more dreams." The man stood up, tears in his eyes and shook his head. Tuberculosis. A horrible disease with no cure. It was no wonder the man had wanted to dream his life away. Yoriichi knew that all of these men and women, these saboteurs, must have similar reasons for wanting to escape the world. He knew how the demon was controlling them and the thought made him even angrier. "What the demon has done to you is unforgivable," Yoriichi told them. "But that doesn't mean I can go easy on you. I'm sorry." With those words, Yoriichi leaped into action. He chopped 2 of the saboteurs in the back of the head, instantly knocking them out. The third, the woman in the green kimono, swung her weapon at him. He dodged it easily and laid her out with a 3rd chop. Turning to the 4th man, the one still crying, he waited to see what he would do. "Are you alright?" Yoriichi asked cautiously. "I am fine now," the man said, smiling. Nezuko rushed up to Yoriichi and flung herself against his chest. Yoriichi patted her head absently and then expanded his senses, looking for the demon. The train was practically overflowing with the demon's presence. Yoriichi guessed that was because it was keeping all of the passengers asleep with its power. Towards the front of the train and on top of the roof, however, was the strongest concentration of demon presence. The main body had to be there. Yoriichi started to take Nezuko with him and then hesitated. The demon who set all of this up had to be strong. Nezuko would no doubt be in danger if she went into battle with him. Beyond that, his friends were vulnerable as they slept, an easy target for any other demons close by. He could not leave them unprotected. Opening the door to the train car, Yoriichi felt the wind begin to tug at his hair and clothes. To reach the demon, he would need to climb up the ladder on the side of the train car in this wind. He'd deal with the same wind standing on top of the cars. Taking a deep breath, Yoriichi turned to Nezuko. "I need you to protect the others," Yoriichi said. Nezuko growled in protest and shook her head. Yoriichi gave her a firm look. "They are still sleeping and cannot protect themselves. They need you, Nezuko, and so do I." "I won't be able to fight if I know they are in danger," Yoriichi told her. Nezuko's clawed hands turned into fists, but she nodded. When he climbed onto the ladder, she did not try to follow him. Yoriichi put his head down against the wind and ran across the roof towards a man-shaped figure standing on the front car. As Yoriichi came closer, it turned towards him displaying a pale human-like face, short black hair with multicolored ends and one of its eyes branded with the kanji for 1. The demon Yoriichi was now facing was lower one of the 12 Kazuki. "What a shame you are awake now," the demon said. "You could have stayed dreaming forever." "He looks thin and weak," Yoriichi thought, "but he is lower one, so he must be strong. I can't afford to let my guard down even for a moment." "Was the dream I showed you not tailored to fit your every desire?" the demon asked, arms spread wide, hand out dramatically. Oddly, there was a mouth on the outstretched hand closest to Yoriichi. The demon's words made Yoriichi's temperature raise by several degrees. A slow rage smoldered in him. This demon was worse than Upper Six in some ways. It took from humans what was most precious and fragile and then used that to lead them to their doom. It felt no remorse for trespassing on what was most sacred, none at all. Yoriichi raised his sword and stared down the demon. His expression stone. "Not much of a talker are you?" the demon asked, sounding puzzled. "That's fine. I'll still get my answers. You know that I do not have to make the dreams pleasant. If it had been my wish, it could have been a dream where your family was being slaughtered. Would you have liked that more?" That answered one question of Yoriichi's. Lower one could see what it was the dreams showed people. It was dumb luck that Yoriichi's desires did not have to do with his past life much. The demon could have easily stumbled onto the truth about Yoriichi if they had. "Still not talking, I see," the demon said. It sounded amused now. It held its hand over its mouth as if covering a laugh and shut its eyes, smiling. "Here's an idea. I could make the dream about your dear father coming back to life. Would you like that?" Even as the words sank their claws into Yoriichi and drew out more of his rage, Yoriichi realized the demon wasn't attacking for some reason. Maybe its powers worked best on the defensive. Maybe it was stalling. Either way, Yoriichi was content to be the one attacking first. Charging forward, Yoriichi readied his sword to deliver a devastating slash to the demon's neck. The demon stuck out the hand with the mouth on it. The mouth spoke, "Go to sleep." Instantly, Yoriichi's eyelids slammed shut and he found himself on the mountainside again. Before anyone or anything could appear, Yoriichi sliced his own neck open. Catching himself mid-fall, Yoriichi slashed at the demon, forcing it to jump away. First there was a look of confusion on the demon's face and then its eyes locked on the earrings swinging from Yoriichi's ears. "Those earrings, you are one Lord Muzan once dead. You came to me like a moth to a flame. If I kill you and bring him your head, he will reward me with even more of his blood. I'll be able to challenge and overcome an upper rank, the demon crowed. It turned on Yoriichi with renewed vigor and ordered him, sleep now. A wave of power flowed outward and again Yoriichi's eyes began to shut without his permission. Another slice to his neck and Yoriichi regained himself once more. He continued to charge forward even as the demon hurled the sleep command at him again and again. Each time Yoriichi responded to the command the same way, by killing his dream self and continuing onwards. The demon stood there, eyes wide in surprise and fear as Yoriichi drew closer. It leaped away from his attacks with the agility of a gymnast, continuing to give commands as it went. It seemed like a stalemate. Yoriichi knew better. Each of his blows was getting closer and closer to cutting the demon. One blow took off a bit of its clothes, another a few strands of its hair. In desperation, the demon sent yet another sleep command at him. This time, before he could cut his neck, Yoriichi heard a child crying. Specifically, he heard Rokuta crying out, demanding to know why Yoriichi hadn't saved him. To know where Yoriichi was when they had needed him. Takeo came out of the darkness, drenched in his own blood and full of accusation. A trembling hand clutched his clothes, and Yoriichi turned to see Hanako. "Why do you always survive when everyone else dies?" she asked. Yoriichi's heart wrenched. It was the same question he had asked himself. He continued to ask himself it every time someone else, someone close to him died. "You think you can save everyone?" Tanjiro demanded next. "You can't even save your own family. Twice you were given the chance. Twice you have failed. You are worthless." Yoriichi's heart ached at the words. He knew them, had said them to himself in his darkest hours. In any other circumstance, they might have been enough to stop him. "How dare you," he said. "Use their precious memories like that. They would never say those things to me. Never try to bring me down. For you to toy with them like this. To dishonor them in this way. Is unforgivable." With those words, Yoriichi awoke and dashed forward. He moved so quick, the demon had no time to react. Yoriichi's sword flicked upwards and across in the devastating first move of flame breathing. The blade sliced cleanly through the demon's neck. Its eyes wide, the demon's head slowly toppled from its shoulders to land on the roof of the train car. Yoriichi watched as the body crumpled to the ground, still bleeding from its neck. The body wasn't dissolving and the head continued to stare at him. Something was wrong. "I understand his orders now. Why he wanted you to be killed along with the Hashira," the head declared. A fleshy appendage bubbled up from the roof of the train car and attached itself to the head like a neck. The glistening pink, fleshy tendril rose, allowing the head to look down on Yoriichi as it continued to speak. "Your very existence is a gaping, festering sore on one's heel." Yoriichi turned to face the demon and looked into the transparent world. To his horror, the demon's presence was now so intertwined with the train, that it was hard to tell where the train ended and the demon began if what he was seeing was correct then. "I can see in your eyes that you know," the demon crowed, mouth open wide in a smile. "You know why decapitating me did not kill me. Since, I am feeling generous, I will confirm it. I'll do it in words so small even you can understand it. What you decapitated wasn't actually my true self. The same is true of what is before you now." The demon's head swayed from side to side on the tendril, almost like the head of a snake before it is about to strike. "While you slept helplessly, I have fused my being with the entire train. Every bit of it is now my blood, my flesh, and even my bones. Oh, but there should be such a look in your eye. Why do you remain blank? Are you a doll whose creator forgot to carve you a face? Is that why the agony you must be feeling does not show on your face?" Yoriichi glanced down at the train car beneath him and the demon laughed. "Oh, the more than 200 passengers on this train. Is it them you are worried for? No need. All 200 of them will soon become part of my body. Did you think you could somehow protect them? That you alone can keep me from feasting on their flesh, their blood, and their essence? They are packed from stem to stern. Beautiful morsels to satiate my appetite in full. Yoriichi lunged at the head, but it laughed and retracted into the roof of the train car where it promptly dissolved. I can't do it alone, Yoriichi thought. I can't protect all the passengers and slay the demon. Somehow, some way, I have to wake up Kaijuro and the others. Running to the nearest edge of the train car, Yoriichi swung himself down off the roof and climbed inside the car. It was packed full of sleeping people, all blissfully unaware as the car around them melted into pink, glistening flesh like the inside of an organ. Fleshy appendages had sprouted and were reaching out for the people. There was a terrific crash and Inosuke fell through a hole he'd just made in the ceiling. Lashing out, he sliced through all the fleshy appendages, cackling like mad as he did so. Yoriichi was never so glad to see or him. Lord Inosuke is coming through, Inosuke bellowed. Inosuke, Yoriichi said. This entire train is now demon. Nowhere on it is safe. We have to protect the passengers. I knew it, Inosuke shouted. I knew this thing was evil. My killer, leader instincts were correct. I'll be sure to save every last one on the train. It is only fair then, that they will worship me as their savior. Lord Inosuke Hashibara is coming through. The tendrils had regenerated and were coming for the passengers with a vengeance. Inosuke leaped into action, slicing through the tendrils at crazy angles with his deadly, serrated swords. Satisfied that this car at least was safe, Yoriichi turned and crossed through the gap in cars to another one. He barely made it through the door before pink, shiny flesh covered over it and trapped him. Tendrils arose from the floor, the ceiling, and the walls, all aimed at Yoriichi and the helpless passengers still trapped within their dreams. Yoriichi slashed through one pair of tendrils and then another. The tendrils themselves were easy to deal with, but a sufficient number of them would make it difficult to defend himself and the passengers. Already, the demon was sending some tendrils directly after Yoriichi and some for the passengers, forcing the demon slayer to split his attention. It is no good, Yoriichi thought. The demon can just regenerate, so cutting the tendrils is delaying at best. The sound of thunder echoed in Yoriichi's ears as he fended off yet another wave of attacks from the train. Did that mean Zenitsu had woken up? Yoriichi hoped it had because there was no way he and Inosuke could protect all the passengers by themselves. They needed enough slayers to defend the passengers and track down the demon's main body in all this mess. They needed. The train around Yoriichi shook and jumped into the air for a moment before crashing back down. It was all Yoriichi could do to keep his feet. Moments later, a bright flash hurtled through the door at the end of the train car and stopped in front of him. It was Kaijuro awake, unharmed, and, from his deceptively cheerful expression, quite angry. Young Kamado, thanks to my strikes on the way here, it should take the demon a while to recuperate. There is still no time to waste. We need a plan before it heals itself completely, Kaijuro said. Yoriichi nodded. We need to split into two groups. One to protect the passengers, the other to find and chop off the demon's head, Kaijuro said. This train has 8 cars. I will protect the rear 5 by myself. The other 3 will be handled by your sister and the boy in yellow. You and the boar-headed lad will go and search for the demon's head. The word surprised Yoriichi. He had expected to be put on the team protecting the passengers while Kaijuro searched for the demon's head and defeated it. To be put on the team searching for the head, Kaijuro had to trust Yoriichi a great deal. The thought made Yoriichi feel almost overwhelmed. We fought together against an upper moon before, Kaijuro said. We triumphed that night because we worked together as one. I know you can find the head and kill the demon. Even if this demon may not seem to have a head, remember that it does have to have one. That is one rule demons have never been able to break. Kaijuro was right. Every encounter with a shape-shifting demon Yoriichi had always ended when the true head was found and the demon decapitated. For some reason, demons could not shift themselves to avoid having a neck. Only Kibutsuji had come close to disobeying that rule. I will search for the head as well while I protect the passengers, but the primary duty of finding the head and killing the demon will belong to you. It is no easy task. I believe in you and believe you can accomplish it. Kayajiro's smile was reassuring and confident as he clapped Yoriichi on the shoulder. For his part, Yoriichi still felt stunned and more than a little overwhelmed. He must have meant what he said about us having the potential to be Hashira, Yoriichi thought. It shouldn't have meant that much to Yoriichi. In his first life, he had been complimented many times, often by his Austrican comrades or even the master of the Demon Slayer Corps on occasion. He'd thought little of it back then. Now in his second life, however, when that awe-inspiring strength was gone and he'd had to work hard for every bit of his strength, he found it made him feel proud and humbled at the same time. I hope you are feeling fired up, Kayajiro said. Releasing Yoriichi's shoulder he stood up, turned towards the back of the car, and vanished in a flash of fire and a rush of displaced air fast enough to ruffle Yoriichi's hair. Kayajiro was right about the situation being urgent. Every moment the demon lived was another moment that one of the slayers could make a mistake and get themselves or a civilian killed. Allowing himself to look into the transparent world, Yoriichi scanned the train. The demon's presence was all around Yoriichi, a surprisingly languid, but aggressive presence. The heart was one car back, hidden between the floorboards and the bottom of the car. The demon's brain occupied most of the engine up front. That meant the spine had to be in the engine as well. Before he returned his vision to normal, Yoriichi located each of his friends. Nezuko was 2 cars back with Zenitsu standing next to her, his presence oddly tranquil. Kayajiro was moving towards them, his presence bright and comforting. It took Yoriichi a moment to locate Inosuke. The boar slayer wasn't in a car, he was running along the top of the train. Inosuke, can you hear me? Yoriichi said loudly. Of course, I can. Nothing escapes the great Lord Inosuke, the boar slayer shouted back. The head is up front by the engine, we should, Yoriichi began. Mr. Bug Eyes already gave me my marching orders, so shut up, Inosuke interrupted. Besides, my awesome 7th form has already found the master of the train's weak spot. So he can see it then, Yoriichi thought. Does that mean he can see into the transparent world too? It was a question to ponder later when they were not battling a demon. Inosuke and Kayajiro had both shown strange knowledge. If they were now 3 demon slayer who could see into the transparent world, Yoriichi needed to know. For some reason, the front really creeps me out, Inosuke said. A quick look confirmed that Inosuke was headed for the front of the train and the engine. Yoriichi did the same, moving through the train while Inosuke ran atop the train. As he moved, Yoriichi watched the ceiling and sides of the car warily, waiting for the fleshy growth to sprout fresh appendages and attack him or the slumbering civilians. Nothing stirred. Kayajiro and the others must be keeping the demon busy, Yoriichi thought. Inosuke, it is around where the coal is loaded, right? Yoriichi said. Yeah, that's right. It's the creepiest spot of them all, Inosuke replied. Yoriichi found himself in the first train car. All that separated him from the coal car and the engine now was a flimsy wooden door and a few feet of empty air. Opening the door, Yoriichi was forced to clasp the handle by the door. The force of the wind created by the train's passing was almost strong enough to sweep him away. Setting his feet, Yoriichi looked up towards the top of the train. He leaped upwards, managing to angle himself till he landed feet first on the roof of the train car. From there, he leaped onto the heap of coal being carried in the car closest to the engine. Inosuke already stood on it, looking down on the roof covering the back of the engine car. He did not spare Yoriichi even a glance. This must be it, Inosuke said. Taking out his blades, he sliced through the roof, sending several sheets of metal and swaths of unnatural pink flesh flying backwards in the wake of the train. From his place beside the engine, a conductor stared up at them, his face drained of all color. His wide eyes were locked on Inosuke, who jumped down to stand next to the engine. Yoriichi gathered himself to leap after Inosuke. As he did, he noticed the pink flesh at the edges of the destroyed roof start to shiver and then grow. "Inosuke, watch out," Yoriichi yelled. Inosuke did not seem to hear him. The boar slayer pointed one of his swords at the conductor, whom he started to interrogate. The conductor asked who they were in a quavering voice and then demanded Inosuke leave. Ignoring him, Inosuke looked at the floor of the engine and then raised his swords, preparing to slash it. Dozens of fleshy tendrils with hand-like projections shot out towards Inosuke from the edges of the roof and the walls. Before any could reach him, Yoriichi fell through the air and into the car, slashing the tendrils to pieces in 2 swift blows. He landed beside Inosuke in a crouch. An oddly nasal howl sounded throughout the train. The sound seemed despairing, but most of what Yoriichi heard and detected in the demon's presence was rage. Rage at the pitiful humans who were attempting to destroy him. Kneeling down, Yoriichi stared at the floor of the engine car. In the transparent world, a long, thick bone divided into segments was underneath him. It was the edge of the demon's spine, its neck bone. "The neck is right underneath us," Yoriichi said. "You don't give the orders," Inosuke said, his tone petulant. "I'm the leader, remember." Yoriichi just looked at him. Inosuke snorted and then leaped into the air, raising his swords above his head. He then dived down, opened the floor of the engine car and cut it into 4 jagged pieces with 1 slice from his sword. The strike exposed a spine as wide as Inosuke and Tanjiro put together. Each bleached white link was as tall as a human. Layered around the bones were stringy, pink threads of muscle. Swiftly, Yoriichi struck down at the exposed bone, but his stroke was reflected by several fleshy tendrils. In a flash, the bone was covered over by new, slick pink flesh and a mass of new tendrils sprouted from the spot. Inosuke jumped one way and Yoriichi scooped up the conductor and jumped another way. Landing on the bed of unused coal, Yoriichi gently put down the conductor and turned to find that a wide cylinder of new demon flesh had grown around and above the neck. The spot where the neck had been exposed was now the center of the cylinder. "It is healing too quickly," Yoriichi thought. "I need to sever the bone in a single strike, but the demon will block me with more of those tendrils. I can't cut through those tendrils and still have enough power left to reach the neck." Yoriichi's eyes found Inosuke. The boar slayer stood on the other side of the fleshy demonic cylinder, staring down at the spot where the demon's neck had been exposed. That was when he had an idea. One that might not have occurred to him in his previous body. "None of us has to fight alone," Yoriichi thought. "Inosuke, let's work together. Clear a path for me to the bone and I'll strike at it," Yoriichi said. To his surprise, the boar slayer enthusiastically agreed. There was no whining about orders or being the leader. Inosuke knew they were facing a deadly challenge. His focus had become narrow, like a beast with a single goal in mind. Both swordsmen readied themselves and then began to move. A gloppy mass of flesh grew in front of Yoriichi and dozens of blue eyes marked with the kanji for lower one appeared. One stared directly at Yoriichi and he felt himself slip into a dream. Yoriichi cut his neck and woke a second later, but the moment of unconscious had cost him his momentum. His steps faltered and then stopped. "Inosuke, if you fall asleep, then kill yourself in your dream," Yoriichi shouted. "You will wake back up." The mass of flesh and eyes blocked Inosuke from view. Yoriichi could only hope that his warning had been heard and understood. His gaze averted from the lump of flesh, Yoriichi leaped down into the cylinder. An eye appeared on the flesh in front of Yoriichi and he was again forced into sleep. Instead of landing in the cylinder on his feet, Yoriichi landed hard on his knees. He'd barely managed to wake up before the impact. Opening his eyes again, he found himself looking directly at one of the demon eyes. He dreamed once more and died once more. "The demon can spawn eyes wherever I am looking. Is there no way to avoid them? Yoriichi thought. Yoriichi kept his eyes closed for a moment after waking. There had to be a way to stop falling asleep. A simple solution occurred to Yoriichi. He stood up, still with his eyes closed, and then looked into the transparent world. The eyes appeared as swirling mass of demonic power dotted across the large mass of the demon's flesh. He could see Inosuke on the other side of the demon cylinder, muscles tensing and relaxing as he swung his swords. Beneath him, the neck bone took up most of the floor. He could see it all. Without opening his eyes. All he had to do was trust in the transparent world. You look like a fool keeping your eyes closed, Inosuke commented. You look like Zenitsu. Despite the situation, Yoriichi nearly smiled. His method of fighting with his eyes closed was like Zenitsu, sleep fighting. That sleep fighting was an interesting issue that he would need to confront Zenitsu about, but he would do that later, when they were not fighting a demon. Inosuke, we should, Yoriichi began. He spotted the conductor standing in the demon cylinder and stopped. The man was swaying on his feet and deep bags sagged beneath his eyes on a chalk-white face. Even if the man had been entirely well, it was too dangerous for him to be here. Before Yoriichi could warn the man to step back, he pulled out a tool like the one the saboteurs had attacked with, a sharp steel spike with a wooden handle. The conductor's muscles tensed as he prepared to spring at Inosuke. There wasn't time for a warning, only for action. Yoriichi reached Inosuke just in time to push the boar slayer aside. A spear of white-hot pain shot from Yoriichi's stomach and he looked down to see the spike on the weapon buried to the hilt in his gut. Get away from him, Inosuke shouted, pushing the conductor back from Yoriichi. I am fine, Yoriichi said. Fine, my eye. You are bleeding and it is still stuck in your stomach, Inosuke protested. It is a scratch, Yoriichi said. He grasped the handle of the weapon. The feeling of the blade shifting inside of his body was off-putting. Taking a deep breath, Yoriichi pulled back on the handle and slowly, but surely pulled the spike from his stomach. He could feel a trickle of hot blood soak his clothes and start to run down his torso. I can deal with it later, Yoriichi said. Because I have to. Yoriichi thought. Now is not the time to nurse my wounds. Behind Inosuke, the conductor was sneaking forward, reaching for the blood-covered spike in Yoriichi's hand. Yoriichi knocked him out with the flat of his sword and then started to drag the conductor's limp body away. Forget about him. He stabbed you, Inosuke said indignantly. Ignoring him, Yoriichi dragged the body to the edge of the demon cylinder, well back from the large mass of flesh which covered the neck. The mass had sprouted fleshy hands and was trying to attack Inosuke. We need to hurry, Yoriichi said, after he had propped the conductor up against the wall of the cylinder. As the two demon slayers readied themselves to attack again, tendrils erupted from the rim of the cylinder. The tendrils shot up in height and then sprouted hand-like projections that shot out at Yoriichi and Inosuke, attempting to grab or squish them. Leaping away, Yoriichi and Inosuke cut away any tendrils that drew close to him. We need to attack together, Yoriichi said. To attack as one. Inosuke nodded and together they leaped. Out of the demon cylinder and onto the coal car behind it. They met each other's eyes as best they could with Inosuke's hidden behind a mask and Yoriichi's still closed, then leaped into the air together. The tall tendrils sprouted higher, waving around and trying to ensnare them as they dove headfirst towards the center of the demon cylinder and its neck. Each tendrils that came near was sliced through in a spray of blood. Yoriichi felt a surge in power as hundreds of eyes opened up along the demon's skin. With his own eyes closed and Inosuke's eyes hidden, however, the effort was in vain. Inosuke reached the target first. With a mad cackle, he sliced through the flesh and steel covering the neck bone in a single slice. Then it was Yoriichi's turn to strike the now exposed neck bone. Twisting in mid-air, Yoriichi pulled back his arms, gathered all of his strength together. His body, already warm from the sun-breathing he had been doing during the leap, became hotter still and his blade turned the deep cherry red of metal left in the forge for hours on end. As soon as he neared the end of his leap, Yoriichi released the strike. His blade sung through the air. When it encountered the bone, Yoriichi could feel the hard tug of resistance, but the blade kept moving, traveling through the bone and out the other side. A high-pitched nasally scream rang through the night and the train suddenly flew free of the tracks. Hand-like projections sprouted and reached for the sky, as if hoping to grasp some help from there. Then the entire train flipped over onto its side and began to skid along the tracks in a shower of sparks. Yoriichi and Inosuke were flung from the train. As the world spun, Yoriichi opened his eyes and caught glimpses of the train still skidding along the track. He mentally cursed himself for not thinking about what would happen to the train when the demon died. How many civilians are still going to die? Yoriichi wondered. With a bone-jarring impact, Yoriichi hit the ground. His body rolled over and over again before finally skidding to a stop. He blacked out for a moment and then came to on his back, looking up at the stars overhead. The train must have stopped skidding because he didn't hear anything else moving. "Gentaro, are you alright?" Inosuke yelled from somewhere nearby. Yoriichi heard the sound of footsteps crunching towards him, and moments later, Inosuke's boar mask appeared above him. "You got stabbed, right?" Inosuke shouted. "How is your stomach?" The volume made Yoriichi's ears hurt. The rest of his body felt battered and bruised from using sun breathing and from the fall from the train. The wound in his stomach was throbbing and he could feel warm pulses of blood leaking from it. Yoriichi struggled to push himself upright. "What are you doing?" Inosuke demanded. "You have been stabbed, remember. Stop trying to sit up." After a few more moments of effort, Yoriichi managed to pull himself to a sitting position. "I am alright," Yoriichi told Inosuke. "What about you?" "Never been better," Inosuke said proudly. There were a few bruises and scrapes Yoriichi could see on Inosuke's arms and torso. The boar slayer's skin was covered in a fine layer of dirt and dust, likely from the now settling cloud of dust the train had kicked up when it landed. From where he sat, Yoriichi could see the train lying on its side, twisted broken metal gleaming dully in the moonlight. Yoriichi tried to stand up, but only managed to raise himself a few inches above the dirt before he fell back to the ground. "I can't move much right now," Yoriichi said. "Please, go help the others. Check for anyone who is hurt. The conductor, is he alright? Did you hit your herd or something? He is the one who stabbed you." "I don't care if he died," Inosuke protested. "Not that you need to know, but his leg is shattered and he can't walk anymore." "It wasn't his fault," Yoriichi said. "The demon was controlling him. It toyed with his hopes and fears, making him dance on invisible strings like a puppet. What it did to him was unforgivable." Yoriichi was rarely the vengeful sort, but at that moment he hoped the demon was suffering as its body crumbled to dust. Maybe through its own personal nightmare, it would understand the suffering it had caused humans. Blood demon arts that allowed demons to play with human lives in such a way were worse than any physical blood demon art could be. They attacked a person's very spirit. "He still stabbed you," Inosuke insisted. The boar slayer's presence felt angry. It would take more effort to make Inosuke understand that the conductor had been a pawn. Yoriichi needed to try a different argument. "His shattered leg is punishment enough," Yoriichi said. "He will be unable to walk for the rest of his life and will have to depend on others. No other punishment is needed. Please, for my sake, help him." Inosuke growled and his body still shook with suppressed rage. He stood up and turned his back to Yoriichi. "I'll do it. But only for you. As a leader, I have to take care of my underlings. After I've rescued him, I'll pluck out all of his hair as a punishment." Inosuke stomped off towards the train. Squinting, Yoriichi could make out the conductor lying next to the engine car with one leg trapped underneath it. Satisfied of his safety, Yoriichi scanned the area as best he could for Nezuko. While he couldn't see her, he located her presence and felt that she was unconscious and exhausted yet safe. Zenitsu's presence was close to her, showing the same strain as Nezuko's. Letting out a breath, Yoriichi relaxed slightly. His sister and his friends were relatively unharmed. Yoriichi started to search for Kaijuro. The Hashira's large, bright presence was directly behind him. Looking up, Yoriichi found himself meeting Kaijuro's golden eyes. The Hashira stood above Yoriichi, looking down. From what he could see, Kaijuro didn't appear to have so much as a scratch or bruise anywhere on his body. The Hashira's body and presence didn't appear tired either. Yoriichi remembered when he had that much stamina and felt a pang of longing for his old body. "Well done, young Kamado," Kaijuro said, looking him over. "You and the boar-headed lad have more than exceeded my expectations. You not only killed the demon, you escaped without much serious injury." An expression of concern crossed Kaijuro's face when he spotted the still bleeding wound in Yoriichi's gut. "That wound in your gut is still bleeding. You can close it, but you will have to regulate your bleeding and take full control of it. If you focus on it, can you see it? The torn blood vessel." Yoriichi knew without a doubt that he could, even before he looked at himself through the transparent world. The question was how Kaijuro could. "Concentrate harder," Kaijuro urged. Turning his attention back to his wound, Yoriichi located the blood vessel. The cloud of blood surrounding it made picking out the individual artery easy enough. At Kaijuro's urging, Yoriichi relaxed the blood vessel and then coaxed it closed. Kaijuro walked around to stand in front of Yoriichi and then knelt. "You succeeded," Kaijuro noted. "You can see it, can't you? That's how you knew where precisely that civilian was injured and how you found your own injury now." Cautiously, Yoriichi nodded. "And you?" "Yes," Kaijuro said. "But I didn't see it until after I became a Hashira. I've spoken with the Hashira and found none of them are able to see it. I don't know how I developed it or even what it is." "Do you?" "I was born with it," Yoriichi said. "So you don't know much about it either," Kaijuro guessed. Yoriichi was glad Kaijuro hadn't phrased it as a question. He was already keeping more from the Hashira than he should. More lies would have felt like too much. "Enough about that," Kaijuro said. "As for the civilians, many were injured in the crash, but all of them are safe. There is no reason for you to strain yourself. I need you whole again soon, so rest up. No casualties." It was a miracle. It was more than Yoriichi had dared hope for. Yoriichi started to thank Kaijuro, then stopped as a massive presence appeared on the edge of his senses. The malice in the energy, the way it curled in on itself and tore at itself like a tempest, warned Yoriichi that it had to be a demon he was sensing. The sheer size and power made Upper Six seem like a candle flame in the wind by comparison. Kaijuro tensed a moment later and Yoriichi saw him spin around to face the presence. His hand was on the hilt of his sheathed sword. A dust cloud rose, obscuring all but the demon's glowing yellow eyes. As the cloud dissipated, Yoriichi saw a man-shaped demon with bright pink hair and gray skin with blue stripes crouched on bare feet. The demon wore trousers and a vest with no shirt along with strings of beads at its ankles. Black kanji on its eyes spelled out Upper 3.